It began in the blazing heat of the Russian summer, in 1942, when Hitler's ambitions once again outgrew the limits of reason. Operation Blue, or Fall Blau, as the Germans called it, was meant to be the decisive blow that would bring the Soviet Union to its knees. After the bitter winter defeat outside Moscow, Hitler refused to retreat or rethink. Instead, he dreamed even bigger. He ordered the Wehrmacht to strike deep into the south, to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, to seize the Volga River, and to starve the Red Army of the fuel that kept its tanks moving. It was to be a campaign of lightning speed, total domination, and economic strangulation, a war not just for victory but for survival. In June 1942, the German war machine roared back to life. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and countless trucks and aircraft poured across the steppe, heading for Stalingrad, Rostov, and Baku. Dust clouds rose over the endless plains. The black cross of the Luftwaffe dominated the sky once more. At first, the Germans believed the nightmare of the Russian winter had been forgotten. Villages burned, Soviet armies retreated, and Hitler's confidence swelled. He divided his forces, splitting Army Group South into two, one to seize Stalingrad, the other to capture the oil of the Caucasus. It was a gamble so vast, so reckless, that even his own generals protested. But in Hitler's mind, destiny favored the bold. Yet beneath the triumphant steel, cracks began to form. The supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles. Fuel ran low, vehicles broke down, and men grew exhausted in the merciless heat. The Soviets, battered but unbroken, retreated strategically, burning everything behind them. Villages were reduced to ash, oil wells set ablaze, a scorched earth that offered the Germans nothing but dust and despair. By autumn, the dream of conquering the Soviet South had turned into a logistical nightmare. The once unstoppable German divisions found themselves overextended, undersupplied, and surrounded by an enemy that refused to die. Now at Stalingrad, the tide turned. What began as an oil war for the Caucasus became a death struggle on the banks of the Volga. Operation Blue had promised Hitler the riches of the Soviet Union. Instead, it delivered catastrophe. Entire armies would be lost. The myth of German invincibility shattered, and from that moment onward, the war in the East would never again be the same. Tonight we'll trace the rise and ruin of Operation Blue, from its daring beginnings and flawed strategy, to the exhaustion, miscalculation, and eventual collapse that sealed the fate of the Eastern Front. We'll uncover the chaos within the German High Command, the brutal cost on the ground, and the cruel irony of an operation that achieved everything except success. This is the story of ambition turned to arrogance, of a campaign that reached too far, too fast, and left an empire broken in its wake. This is Operation Blue, the road to Stalingrad, the beginning of the end for the German war in the East. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it for you, as we dive into the blazing summer of 1942, the year when one man's greed for oil and glory ignited one of history's greatest disasters, Operation Blue, the German gamble that doomed the Eastern Front. The winter of 1941 lay like a frozen shroud over the Russian plains, a season of death that neither side would ever forget. Fields that once thundered with tank columns were now silent expanses of snow, littered with burnt-out wrecks and unburied men. The great gamble of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's bid to destroy the Soviet Union in a single blow, had stalled in the ice outside Moscow. The Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, now huddled in ruined villages, fighting frostbite more fiercely than the Red Army. Rifles froze solid, engines cracked, and soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, stripped from the dead. In the frozen night, Wolves prowled around the corpses of men who had dreamed of Berlin's triumph. Yet in Führer headquarters, delusion endured like a flame behind glass. Hitler saw not catastrophe, but opportunity, a temporary setback before the final blow. His generals spoke in cautious tones. He answered with conviction bordering on madness. The map of Europe still showed the German eagle perched deep inside Soviet territory, and to him that meant victory was only delayed, not denied. In Berlin, the propaganda machine turned suffering into spectacle. Newsreels spoke of heroic endurance, not starvation, of strategic withdrawals, not defeat. But beneath the surface, the myth of German invincibility had cracked. Entire divisions existed now only on paper, their names whispered like memorials. The Luftwaffe's supply efforts had failed, panzer groups had lost their edge, and the Soviet winter counteroffensive had clawed back precious ground. In command bunkers, officers traced the red arrows of enemy advances with trembling fingers. Hitler blamed the weather, the generals, and destiny itself, never his own hubris. His voice, once confident and measured, now rose with erratic fury, echoing through concrete corridors like the distant rumble of collapsing walls. Yet he remained convinced that the Soviet Union was mortally wounded, bleeding too heavily to survive another campaign. One more push, he said, and the bear will fall. Those words became gospel, carved into the strategy of 1942. Across the Eastern Front, the human cost of Barbarossa defied imagination. Over 4 million German soldiers had marched east the previous summer, and now more than half were gone, dead, wounded, or swallowed by the snow. Frozen corpses leaned against half-destroyed tanks, their eyes open, staring into the endless white. In the villages, children scavenged through debris for scraps of bread as Soviet partisans struck from forests and marshes. The air reeked of smoke, rot, and fuel. The wind carried the sound of distant artillery, dull and mournful. Soldiers spoke less and less. Only silence and coughing filled their trenches. In diaries and letters home, hope gave way to exhaustion, courage to numb obedience. Still, orders came down to prepare for spring, for another offensive, deeper still into the Soviet heart. The men who heard them no longer believed in victory, only in survival. For them, Barbarossa was not a campaign, it was a curse. Inside the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin read the situation with cold calculation. The Red Army had survived its own death sentence. Entire cities had been reduced to ash, millions dead or captured, yet the state endured, reorganizing, regrowing, rediscovering its will to fight. Soviet factories moved east beyond the Urals, now roared back to life beneath camouflage nets and snow. Fresh tanks rolled from Chelyabinsk, rifles from Izhevsk, shells from Sverdlovsk. A miracle of industrial relocation. Stalin's spy networks whispered of German exhaustion, of cracks forming behind enemy lines. His generals urged caution, but he sensed the tide had shifted. They think us broken, he told them. Let them come again. In that moment, amid the smoke of Moscow, the Soviet Union prepared not merely to defend but to outlast. In the German high command, however, optimism still reigned, fragile, forced, but real. Field Marshal von Bock and his staff drafted new maps, new lines, new dreams of conquest. They spoke of seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus, of cutting the Volga at Stalingrad, of starving the Soviet machine of its fuel and blood. Hitler's conferences grew longer, more chaotic, each punctuated by the scraping of pencils and the slam of fists on tables. He no longer trusted his generals' caution. He demanded boldness, motion, certainty. We must strike south, he declared, toward the oil, toward victory. His ideology and his strategy fused into one, a vision of war, not for survival but for domination. And so, while 500,000 soldiers still froze in trenches, the next campaign was already being born in ink and rage. The name for it was Fall Blau, Case Blue. The mood among the troops, however, told another story. Letters intercepted by censors spoke of despair, disbelief, and quiet defiance. "They tell us the Russians are finished," wrote one infantryman, "but every day more of them come." In the field hospitals, men lay wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, whispering that the Führer had lost his mind. Supply officers struggled to find spare parts for tanks buried under snowdrifts. The once proud panzer divisions were shadows of their former selves, rebuilt with captured Soviet machines and men barely out of training. And yet, as spring thawed the land, the soldiers cleaned their rifles and waited. Orders were orders, belief was optional. The Wehrmacht's strength no longer came from faith, it came from habit. They would march again not because they hoped, but because they were told. In the ruins outside Moscow, evidence of the previous year's arrogance lay everywhere. Burnt columns of trucks lined the roads, frozen bodies lay in ditches, and broken weapons jutted from the snow like gravestones. Soviet peasants moved silently through the wreckage, dragging sleds of scavenged metal for scrap. The Red Army, battered but unbroken, gathered its strength along the Don and the Volga. Soviet engineers repaired bridges under shell fire, commissars recited speeches over the roar of engines. For every German tank that rolled forward, 3 Soviet replacements rumbled eastward by rail. Intelligence reports reached Hitler's desk, but he dismissed them as exaggeration, illusions spun by cowards. "The Russians have no more reserves," he insisted. Reality, however, was gathering behind the clouds, vast, cold, and unstoppable. The ghosts of Barbarossa whispered that the East was not conquered, only sleeping. By the spring of 1942, the snow melted into mud, and with it, the memories of failure were buried, at least in the minds of those who chose not to remember. The Wehrmacht reassembled itself, gleaming anew for the cameras, while the wounded limped home in silence. Hitler stood before his generals, promising oil, glory, and vengeance. The map before him glittered with arrows, all pointing south. Beneath the surface, though, the ground was already trembling with the weight of overreach. Every step eastward would stretch the German line thinner. Every victory would carry a hidden cost. The lessons of Barbarossa were written in blood, but no one in power was willing to read them. The ghosts of that failed conquest lingered in every plan, every boast, every lie told to sustain the illusion of control. And as the sun rose over the steppe once more, the next catastrophe was already being drawn, in silence, in arrogance, and in fate's cold ink. In the cold, windowless chambers of Hitler's wolf's lair, maps covered every wall like veins of obsession. Red lines slashed across the Soviet Union, converging toward the southern frontier, toward oil. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of generators, punctuated by the scratch of pencils against maps. Officers stood at attention, their eyes fixed on the Führer's hand as it hovered over the Caucasus like a vulture's shadow. "Baku," he whispered. "Makup Grozny." The words fell heavy, sacred, electric. Around him, silence deepened. Not reverence, but resignation. Hitler's mind burned with visions of fuel tanks, convoys, and flames. The lifeblood of modern war flowing into German veins. Without oil, his war machine would suffocate. With it, he believed he could rule continents. And so, in that bunker deep in East Prussia, the destiny of millions was redrawn over a map slick with sweat and illusion. To the generals, the logic was simple but deadly. Germany was running out of fuel. The panzers that once roared across Europe now sputtered on fumes, and Luftwaffe bombers grounded for want of aviation gasoline. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești could no longer feed the beast that Hitler had built. Each campaign burned more than it captured, and the vast distances of Russia devoured resources faster than they could be replaced. The Caucasus, shimmering like a mirage to the south, promised salvation. Hitler called it the heart of Bolshevism's strength, but in truth, it was the heart of his desperation. His generals, men of experience and scars, warned that dividing the army could spell disaster. But Hitler no longer listened to soldiers, he listened only to his own echo. The southern oil fields became not just a target, but a symbol, a final proof that fate still favored him. And as the spring thawed the mud, preparations for Operation Blue began in earnest. Field Marshal Wilhelm List, commander of the newly formed Army Group A, studied the plan with an unease that he dared not voice. The offensive would split Germany's might into two spears, one driving toward the Caucasus, the other toward the Volga and Stalingrad. It was a move both bold and perilous, the kind of gamble that had once made Hitler's name legendary, but the scale was staggering. Mountain ranges, endless plains, rivers wider than the Rhine. List's officers pored over aerial photographs showing snow-capped peaks, narrow passes and oil wells glinting in the sun. It looked beautiful, even serene and utterly unreachable. Behind the neat lines of ink lay thousands of kilometers of wilderness and resistance. Yet the orders were clear, and disobedience was no longer an option. "The Führer wants the oil," List remarked to a subordinate. "Then he will have it, even if we burn the world to get there." In the industrial heart of Germany, factories pulsed with new life. Steelworkers forged tank parts, machinists shaped airplane engines, and engineers designed mobile refineries to process captured oil in the field. The rhythm of production was relentless, fueled by propaganda, promising a final victory in the east. Posters showed columns of panzers rolling toward mountains of flame and smoke, the conquest of energy itself. But beneath the surface, fear simmered among technicians and planners. They knew the numbers. Railways stretched too thin, fuel reserves dangerously low, and supply lines already breaking under the strain. The Wehrmacht could strike again. Yes, but could it sustain itself once more across the endless steppe? Hitler ignored logistics the way gamblers ignore debt. To him, the Caucasus was not just oil. It was destiny distilled into geography. Every engine turned, every bullet cast in service of that burning dream. In Moscow, Soviet intelligence began to detect whispers of the coming storm. Encrypted transmissions spoke of German troop movements southward, of new units massing near Kharkov and Voronezh. Stalin's generals debated the meaning. Would Hitler strike again at Moscow, or was the south truly his aim? Zhukov, ever the realist, warned that Hitler would chase oil, not glory. Soviet cartographers marked the likely routes: Rostov, Maikop, Grozny, Baku, the arteries of the Soviet war economy. But they could not be everywhere at once. The Red Army was still rebuilding, its ranks filled with new recruits, barely trained to fire their rifles. The factories behind the Urals worked night and day to replace what had been lost, the clang of metal echoing through the Siberian night. And in the Kremlin, Stalin stared at his map, his pipe smoke curling upward like prophecy. "He will come," he said, "and we will bleed him dry in the south." As spring gave way to summer, the German command corridors buzzed with a feverish, almost manic energy. Officers moved through the wolf's lair with stacks of orders, charts, and coded directives. Trains were loaded in the night. Columns of tanks, artillery, and fuel drums snaking eastward under black tarps. The earth shook under the weight of preparation, and the air smelled of oil and iron. Hitler held endless briefings, stabbing his finger at maps as though commanding the land itself to obey. The generals nodded, though many had ceased to believe. In private, they spoke of the Führer's narrowing vision, of his fixation on oil as salvation, when the army's soul was already eroding. Yet they followed him still, bound by fear, ambition, and the machinery of obedience. Operation Blue was no longer a strategy, it was an inevitability, and like all inevitabilities, it carried the scent of tragedy. Among the soldiers gathering in the fields of Ukraine, the talk was of warmth and rest, not oil. They longed for home, for bread without frost, for letters that didn't end in silence. Few knew where they were being sent, and fewer still cared. They cleaned their rifles, mended their boots, and watched the horizon where the steppe met the sky. In the evenings they lit small fires, telling stories of the last campaign, of snow so deep it swallowed men whole. The officers spoke of honor and duty, but the men spoke of survival. The scent of gasoline lingered everywhere, mixing with the smell of earth and sweat. One veteran wrote in his diary, "They say we march for oil, but I march for life." Yet the machine around him rolled on, indifferent, immense, unstoppable. The dreams of the High Command were built upon the backs of men who no longer dreamed at all. By early June, the operations outlines had hardened into destiny. From the Black Sea to the Don River, the German war machine was poised, engines idling, guns gleaming in the sun. The offensive would begin with thunder, roll eastward in dust, and end, so Hitler believed, in fire and triumph. But beneath the bravado, the seeds of failure were already taking root. Every kilometer gained would stretch the lifeline thinner. Every success would feed overconfidence. The oil of the Caucasus gleamed like liquid gold, but it lay behind mountains, rivers, and an enemy that refused to die. As Hitler looked upon the map one last time before signing the orders, he felt certain history itself had bent to his will. He could not hear the whispers of the dead from the winter past, nor the rumble of the Red Army gathering in silence. The dream of the Caucasus shimmered before him like a mirage, and like all mirages, it would vanish the moment he reached for it. After the brutal winter of 1941-42, the Wehrmacht limped into spring with its formations shredded, its supply chains fractured, and its pride deeply wounded by frost and miscalculation. It was a battered colossus. In the ash-strewn training grounds and quiet barracks, staff officers rewrote troop rosters, folded new brigades into shattered corps, and rehearsed the logistics of another great push deeper into Soviet territory. Change was imperative. Army Group South, which had once been a single spear, was cleaved into two commands to spread risk and concentrate force. Army Group A for the southern thrust into the Caucasus, and Army Group B to pin the central front and menace the Volga. It was an act of reconfiguration and of hubris. Fresh divisions arrived from France and the Balkans, motorized infantry that smelled of oil and sawdust, replacements stamped with foreign patches. Even Allied contingents from Romania and Hungary folded into the German order of battle to plug gaping holes. They looked new, the parade ground polish of their uniforms and the shine of newly painted vehicles masked a deeper truth. Many units lacked true combat seasoning and carried wounded souls beneath the taut uniforms. Experience could not be manufactured. In command, tents that smelled of coffee and cold metal. Generals debated maps with a mix of relief and anxiety, while clerks filed reports that read like prayers for success and pleas for fuel. The rhetoric changed. Hitler's staff buzzed with plans for concentrated armored thrusts, for envelopments and deep penetrations, and for the creation of mobile supply hubs that could follow columns across the steppe's endless distances. Ambition outpaced realism, yet among the staff there were quieter voices, commanders who remembered the malfunctions of winter, who had seen engines seize and soldiers freeze to death on nights when orders demanded speed. they were cautious. These officers insisted on more fuel, more rail cars, and a rethinking of vulnerability in static supply lines, but their cautions were met by a combination of denial, political pressure, and the need to maintain momentum. Practicality faltered, and so the rebirth of the Wehrmacht took on the contours of a revival staged for morale as much as strategy, a reconstruction that relied on borrowed men, hurried training, and faith in German mechanized doctrine. Faith, however, is no shield. In training grounds south of Berlin, young conscripts learned to drive half-track vehicles, to maintain radios, and to navigate maps that promised glory and demanded silence about the past year's failures. They were taught quickly. Veteran NCOs barked commands while instructors powdered the narratives of victory with practical lessons in convoy discipline and fuel conservation, trying to pass on hard-won knowledge in a compressed timetable. Time was short. Mechanics worked around the clock to refurbish Panzer IVs, to cannibalize parts from wrecks, and to fit captured Soviet tanks with German radios so they might move in mixed formations. Improvisation became routine. These improvised brigades, though effective in improvisation, carried risks, communications mismatches, unfamiliar parts, and crews who lacked trust in one another under fire. Risk multiplied. Still, when the columns finally rolled eastward, a brittle glamour accompanied them. Banners fluttered, trumpets blared in propaganda dispatches, and the German war machine presented itself as renewed and relentless. Appearances reassured many. Across occupied Europe, the transfer of units from France and the Balkans brought men hardened by garrison duty, but untested in the scale of Eastern mechanized warfare, their boots still carrying the dust of old occupation rather than the mud of Russian battlefields. They were different. Soldiers from the Balkans added language and cultural friction into formations, officers juggling translators and trust as they integrated with German cadres, while foreign volunteer units offered manpower but often less cohesion. Coordination strained. Romanian divisions, swollen with local knowledge, became the Wehrmacht's thin flank, their loyalty useful but their equipment often inferior and their morale fragile under the shock of modern combined arms. They were essential and vulnerable. Such alliances amplified Germany's reach but introduced new fault lines where logistics and command could spark catastrophe. Alliances carry costs. In the field, German junior officers worried privately as patrol reports described partisan activity increasing, as supply trains were ambushed and as the steppe itself seemed to resist occupation with a slow grinding pressure. Doubt settled in ranks. At the operational centers near Kharkov, staff officers simulated potential routes to the Caucasus, calculating fuel burns, railway capacities, and the time needed to move motorized corps through bottlenecks and river crossings. Numbers told a story. Planners drew up tables that showed the unforgiving arithmetic. Every extra kilometer demanded more fuel, every diverted train cost days, and every delay risked exposure to counterattack. The math was cruel. In quieter moments, commanders visited field hospitals and watched pale faces of men who had returned from the winter front, and some could not reconcile the glossy plans on their desks with the reality of human fragility before them. Reality intruded. They ordered reconnaissance to probe transit routes, to find bridges that could bear tanks, and to mark villages suitable for temporary depots, knowing that the success of any grand strategy would hinge on these small, brutal details. Logistics would decide battles. Meanwhile, German engineers drew up plans to build field workshops and mobile fuel dumps that could leapfrog with spearheads, an effort that revealed both ingenuity and the sheer desperation underlying the rebirth. Desperation drove invention. For many senior commanders, the split of Army Group South signaled not only a tactical shift but a psychological transformation. The German army would now fight on multiple axes, and with that came a dilution of focus and an expansion of vulnerability. It was a dangerous turn. Field marshal commanders, once able to concentrate force with brutal clarity, now had to juggle competing objectives while praying that railheads and fuel trains would hold against weather and partisan saboteurs. Prayer replaced certainty, and yet public reports and radio broadcasts were concise and triumphant, painting the reconstitution as a phoenix rising, which bolstered civilian morale and masked strategic fragility for a time. Perception mattered. In private, staff meetings bubbled with forecasts of rapid advances, estimates of captured fuel, and confidence that the Red Army's depth had been exhausted by previous blows. Confidence was contagious. But even as the Wehrmacht claimed renewal, the spectre of 1941 lingered like a shadow over every depot, reminding planners that the missteps of hubris could recur in any campaign built on haste. History whispered warnings. At the front line, soldiers felt the rebirth unevenly. Units reformed as mixed cohorts where veterans tried to school raw recruits on maneuver, camouflage, and the brutal etiquette of survival that no manual could teach. Teaching came hard. Night drills simulated fuel shortages. Command posts rehearsed convoy defense against partisan hits, and medics practiced triage with grim efficiency under the watchful eyes of commanders who feared attrition more than battle. They prepared for attrition. Anecdotes circulated of an old tank commander who welded extra plates onto a battered hull and swore his crew could outlast any storm, a small act of stubbornness that lifted morale in a unit accustomed to loss. Courage persisted. Away from the shine of propaganda, soldiers traded stories around low fires about home gardens and futures that might never come, and these human threads braided into a quiet determination to endure. Hope endured too. Yet every supply delay, every mismatched radio set, and every scouted bridge that could not bear weight gnawed at the illusion of rebirth until it seemed less like revival and more like a fragile theatrical set. The theatre was thin. As the drums of mobilization beat and columns wound eastward once more, the Wehrmacht presented itself as renewed, sharper tanks, patched uniforms, and a doctrine that still believed speed and surprise could rewrite fate. It moved with purpose. High command issued orders that fused strategy with prophecy, convinced that this reconfiguration would correct past sins and deliver the Soviet South into German hands. They were resolute. But beneath the clatter of wheels and the bravado of printed communiques, the same fragile truths remained. Stretched lines, improvised brigades, and the stubborn, unseen strength of an enemy who had not been vanquished. Fragility remained. In training grounds, armories, and field kitchens, men readied themselves for a campaign that promised renewal, but carried within it the seeds of a far greater undoing. Preparation felt double-edged. The rebirth was real in form but partial in substance. A phoenix painted on canvas while the true fire smouldered beneath the steppe, waiting to reveal how thin the veneer of revival truly was. And so the army walked forward, reborn but haunted. The Kremlin in early 1942 was a fortress of fatigue and vigilance, its corridors echoing with hurried footsteps and muffled arguments. Moscow's winter victory had been costly. A reprieve bought in blood, not a triumph earned in strength. Stalin walked those halls with a cigarette burning low between his fingers, eyes fixed on the maps that still bled red across the southern front. His mood oscillated between suspicion and calculation, the scars of 1941 still fresh in his mind. Reports from the southern sectors spoke of German regrouping, of armoured trains moving east, of fresh divisions massing near Kharkov. He listened in silence, the room heavy with the scent of tobacco and ink, before cutting through the air with his gravel voice. "They will come again." The generals shifted uneasily. No one doubted it. Stalin had learned not to underestimate his enemy, not after the catastrophe of Barbarossa, but he had also learned something more dangerous: patience. And as the wind howled outside the Kremlin walls, his gaze turned southward to the lands of oil, grain, and destiny. For Stalin, the south was both lifeline and wound. The Don Basin held coal, the Caucasus held oil, and beyond them lay the arteries that kept Soviet industry breathing. If the Germans seized those, the Red Army would not just lose ground, it would lose its heartbeat. Intelligence officers brought warnings daily: decrypted radio chatter, captured letters, aerial photographs showing troop concentrations near the Don. Some were ambiguous, some exaggerated, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Wehrmacht was gathering strength once more. Stalin's wariness hardened into obsession. He summoned Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and Beria, forcing long nights of argument beneath the cold gleam of lamps. Voices rose, charts slammed against tables, tempers flared over where to place reserves and how to defend both Stalingrad and the Caucasus simultaneously. To defend both meant to defend neither fully. Stalin, pacing slowly, exhaled smoke through his nose like a locomotive under strain. "We will cover the south," he said. "If they want our oil, they will drown in it." The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, worked tirelessly to rebuild the army that winter had nearly destroyed. Across the Volga and the Urals, assembly lines clattered without pause, welding, hammering, forging the bones of a resurrected war machine. Women worked 12-hour shifts at lathes, their faces smudged with soot and resolve, while men too old for combat drove trains through nights without headlights to avoid Luftwaffe raids. The rhythm of industry became a hymn of survival. Each rifle, each tank, each artillery shell carried the defiance of a nation that refused extinction. The Red Army, still bleeding, began to refill its veins with conscripts drawn from every village, town, and steppe. Many had never seen a tank before. Some had no boots. They arrived in camps wrapped in blankets and hunger, taught to march by men who themselves had barely survived the retreats of 1941. It was not an army of finesse. It was an army of endurance. And in that endurance, Stalin saw a weapon more powerful than steel. Inside the command bunkers at Stavka, arguments flared like sparks in the dark. Zhukov, now a legend after Moscow, urged concentration in the center. He feared that spreading forces too thin would invite another encirclement. Vasilevsky, his voice measured but firm, countered that the south was the enemy's true goal. "Hitler needs oil," he insisted, pointing at the black-marked fields of Baku and Maikop. Stalin watched them both, weighing pride against reason, past victories against future threats. The war had taught him to distrust certainty, to doubt even his own instincts. And so, through compromise and coercion, he ordered a defensive network along the southern rivers, the Don, the Donets, and the Volga, to be fortified with trenches, mines, and machine gun nests. He knew it would not be enough, but it would buy time, and in 1942, time was the most precious currency the Soviet Union possessed. Outside, the first thaws of spring turned the roads to rivers of mud, as though the land itself tried to slow the coming storm. In the southern steppes, Soviet soldiers dug trenches that filled with cold water and silt, their hands numb, their breath fogging in the grey dawn. Supply trucks bogged down in mud, horses sank to their bellies, and yet the work went on without rest. Commissars moved among them, shouting slogans, reciting oaths of loyalty to the motherland. reminding each man that he was the line between Russia and ruin. Fear was their fuel, duty their discipline. Behind them, Red Army engineers rebuilt bridges and rail lines that had been bombed to splinters, improvising with timber, scavenged metal, and miracles. Every nail driven into wood echoed like defiance. Civilians joined the effort. Old men digging, women sewing sandbags, children carrying water for the laborers. It was a nation mobilized not by enthusiasm but by the terror of what would happen if they failed. Across the horizon, the steppe shimmered with heat and smoke from distant artillery drills, and somewhere far to the west, German engines were already stirring. Within Stalin's war cabinet, fear was balanced by a newfound sense of purpose. The Soviet leader who had once silenced his generals now began, cautiously, to listen. The disasters of 1941 had humbled him. The near loss of Moscow had taught him the cost of arrogance. Now he delegated selectively, strategically, granting commanders authority in execution, while maintaining control over vision. It was a shift both practical and psychological, born not of trust but necessity. Zhukov and Vasilevsky coordinated the rebuilding of reserves, while Shaposhnikov and Antonov worked on integrating partisans into wider intelligence networks. The Red Army began to resemble not a desperate mob, but an organized, evolving machine. Training programs multiplied, discipline hardened, and the ghosts of 1941 slowly gave way to a grim professionalism. Soviet soldiers now drilled not just to fight but to endure, to survive the storm that was certain to come. And above them all Stalin waited, watching the southern map as if willing the land itself to resist. As intelligence confirmed the German build-up near Kharkov and the Don, Stalin faced an agonizing choice: strike preemptively or brace for impact. Some urged offense, arguing that a counterblow could disrupt the enemy before his armor gathered. Others warned that such rashness had led to disaster the year before. The debate raged like fire under ice. In May 1942, Stalin approved a limited offensive near Kharkov, a decision born of hope and impatience. It began with thunder and confidence, but ended in catastrophe. German counterattacks encircled Soviet formations, annihilating tens of thousands of men in another echo of 1941's nightmare. When the reports reached Moscow, Stalin read them in silence, his face unmoving, his hand steady as he lit another cigarette. He had gambled and lost, but this time he would not deny the lesson. The South, he realized, would be the crucible where the Soviet Union would either die or be reborn, and from that moment on, his focus became absolute. By summer, the steppe was alive with the sound of engines, both German and Soviet, moving toward each other like opposing tides. Stalin's southern armies stood battered but unbroken, their ranks filled with men too young to fear and too hardened to hope. Behind them, factories thundered, locomotives screamed, and the black smoke of industry rolled across the sky like a second front. The Soviet Union was learning how to fight a war of exhaustion, one that consumed everything but the will to exist. Stalin rarely smiled now, but in his silence there was steel, not despair. His spies reported that Hitler's gaze was fixed on the Caucasus, and so he waited, knowing that obsession was the enemy's greatest weakness. The battle to come would not be about oil or territory alone, it would be a battle for endurance, for who could suffer longer without breaking. The Red Army was not ready, but it was no longer blind. The winds shifted, the rivers ran high, and the South prepared to burn. And as Stalin stood by the window of his office, the distant thunder of the coming storm rolled across the endless plains of Russia. June 28th, 1942. Dawn broke over the steppe in a haze of gold and gunpowder. The air trembled with the low growl of engines, the rhythm of an army awakening for conquest. Dust hung like smoke, turning sunlight into molten bronze as thousands of panzers idled in endless lines. To the east the horizon shimmered, vast, unbroken, indifferent. At 4 o'clock hours the first shells fell, their concussions rolling across the plain like the drums of judgment. Operation Blue had begun. The German summer offensive surged forward with renewed ferocity, an orchestra of movement choreographed by speed and precision. Fighter-bombers strafed Soviet positions, plumes of earth rising in violent blossoms. The Wehrmacht had learned from its winter humiliation. Now it advanced not with chaos, but with lethal rhythm. And as the first villages burned, the dream of the Caucasus roared back to life on the wings of fire and ambition. The German armor moved like steel rivers, glinting under the punishing sun. Tigers, Panzer IIs, and Ivies rolled side by side, their treads grinding through fields of wheat turned to dust beneath their weight. The wind carried the metallic scent of oil and ozone, mingling with the bitter smoke of artillery strikes. Infantry clung to the flanks of tanks, faces masked with grime, rifles clattering against hulls. Above them, Stukas screamed downward, their sirens howling a sound that froze the blood of any man below. The Soviet front lines, hastily reconstituted, buckled under the weight of the assault. Trenches collapsed, command posts vanished in flashes of fire, and radio networks disintegrated into static. The pace was relentless, the Wehrmacht timing flawless. It was the kind of warfare Germany had perfected, fast, decisive, and merciless. And as the steppe echoed with thunder, the Don River became the next marker in Hitler's vision of endless advance. On the Soviet side, chaos and courage walked hand in hand. Field commanders struggled to maintain order as communication lines snapped like twigs beneath a storm. Entire regiments were swallowed by dust clouds, their fates unknown except for the sudden silence on the radio. Yet, amid the destruction, pockets of resistance hardened. A machine gun crew cut off from command held its position until their barrels glowed red. Artillery officers fired point blank before abandoning their guns, retreating only when the tanks loomed close enough to see faces behind the glass. Civilians fled eastward in endless columns, wagons creaking, children crying, cattle stumbling through smoke. Behind them, villages burned so fiercely that even the rivers reflected fire. The Soviet retreat was desperate but not broken. From the chaos, the shape of something new began to emerge, a defense forged not by strategy but by fury and survival. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies with an arrogance earned through supremacy. Its squadrons swooped low over the steppe, hammering Soviet supply lines and strafing retreating columns with mechanical precision. Bombs fell in rhythmic succession, their explosions walking across the horizon like measured footsteps. In the heat of noon, air shimmered with fuel vapors, and the ground itself seemed to breathe smoke. Soviet pilots, outnumbered and outgunned, launched in dwindling pairs from makeshift airstrips. Their planes rattled apart in midair, torn by flak and Messerschmitt guns. But still they climbed, driven by duty and defiance, their contrails scarring the sky in fleeting arcs. Every dogfight ended the same way, one plane trailing black smoke, falling like a wounded bird into the fields below. For every Soviet fighter that fell, another would rise from the east, as if the land itself kept producing them. The air war over the Don became a duel between will and exhaustion. One fought not for dominance but for survival. As the German advance widened, the Don Basin turned into a cauldron of flame and movement. Bridges fell under explosives, railway hubs were captured, and the landscape convulsed under the weight of mechanized war. The fields that once fed the Soviet people now fed artillery shells and fuel convoys. At every crossing, sappers raced against time, laying mines in riverbeds and wiring explosives beneath retreating pontoon bridges. The ground shook day and night, its tremors carrying for miles, rattling windows in towns long since abandoned. German motor columns, slick with sweat and dust, pressed onward with machine-like discipline. Yet the farther they moved, the more their supply trains lagged. Fuel depots strained, repair crews collapsed, and heat began to devour men and metal alike. The Don's banks shimmered under the glare of the sun, beautiful and cruel in equal measure. This was not conquest. It was attrition disguised as triumph. And still Hitler demanded more. In Moscow, Stalin received reports written in ash and urgency. Front commanders begged for reinforcements that did not exist, for aircraft that could not arrive, for time that could not be bought. The Soviet leader sat silent, a faint tremor in his hand as he read casualty estimates. He knew the southern armies were being ground to dust, yet he also knew that retreat was not defeat. Not yet. "Hold the Don," he ordered. "Buy me weeks, not miles." And so they did. Soviet divisions fought delaying actions with grim determination, ambushing convoys at night, detonating charges under bridges, and burning anything that could feed the German advance. Each day brought another sunrise, another shipment of tanks from the Urals, another hour for the nation to gather breath. The Red Army bled deliberately, trading flesh for time. In the crucible of retreat, endurance became its only strategy. On the ground, the pace of war turned men into ghosts. The steppe stretched endlessly in every direction, the horizon swallowing hope as easily as it did sunlight. German soldiers fought through the haze of exhaustion, their uniforms stiff with sweat and dust, their lips cracked from thirst. Every mile gained came with a price. Another tank broken, another comrade buried. They called it summer blitz, the summer lightning fast, blinding, and burning everything in its path. Yet some began to notice the flicker behind the brilliance. Soviet resistance was adapting. Partisans struck supply routes at night. Snipers picked off officers in villages thought secure, and new Soviet formations appeared where none were expected. The Germans advanced, yes, but they no longer annihilated. They pursued shadows. It was the first subtle sign that their speed had met its match. Beneath the fires of June, a deeper war was beginning to take shape. By early July, the Don front glowed red on every map, a scar across the southern reaches of Russia. The German army had pushed farther east than any invader in history, yet its confidence carried a quiet tremor. The Soviet line had bent, twisted, and bled, but not broken. Behind it, reserves massed like a gathering storm, silent and unseen beyond the Volga. The air smelled of dust and death, of wheat burning under diesel fumes. Commanders on both sides stared at the horizon, each seeing not land but fate. For Hitler, the path seemed clear. Forward, always forward toward the oil fields and glory. For Stalin, the path was darker. Survival first, vengeance later. Between them lay the Don, wide and shimmering, reflecting the fires of men who thought they were shaping history. But history, as always, was shaping them. In the bitter chill of February 1943, the city of Kharkov stood like a ghost amid snow and smoke, its ruins still echoing the collapse of German dreams. The Red Army, fresh from the victory at Stalingrad, surged westward with unrelenting momentum. Soviet banners fluttered over shattered buildings as their columns rolled into the city, believing they had turned the tide of the war for good. It was an intoxicating moment, the illusion of victory stretching farther than their lines could sustain. The snow hid the truth. Their flanks were thin, their fuel was low, and their coordination was fractured by exhaustion. To the west, German commanders watched and waited, their retreat deliberate, their silence deceptive. Among them were men like Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, cold, calculating, and brilliant under pressure. He saw in Kharkov not a loss, but bait. The Soviets, hungry for glory, had overreached, and soon the trap would close around them like winter itself. The stage for the Third Battle of Kharkov was set not by ambition but by necessity. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht teetered on the edge of collapse, its myth of invincibility shattered in the snows of the Volga. Hitler demanded counterattack, but his generals counselled patience. A rare word in his vocabulary, Manstein, however, saw opportunity in retreat. His plan was elegant and ruthless. Allow the Soviet spearheads to extend beyond their support, then strike their exposed sides with mechanized precision. To execute it, he needed two of the Reich's finest field commanders, Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Friedrich Paulus's surviving staff elements, now under replacement leadership after Stalingrad's destruction. The remnants of Army Group South gathered their strength, sharpening their claws for one last winter blow. Soldiers spoke little. They simply cleaned their rifles, repaired engines, and studied maps by lantern light. The snow muffled their movement, masking the resurgence of a force once thought broken. And as Soviet divisions advanced deeper into the Ukrainian plains, they unknowingly marched into the jaws of their own undoing. By mid-February, the Soviet advance began to strain under its own weight. Tanks ran out of fuel, infantry trudged through waist-deep snow, and supply columns lagged far behind the front. Commanders argued over objectives, whether to consolidate gains or press forward toward the Dnieper. In that confusion, Manstein struck. German armored columns burst from the fog like iron beasts reborn, their cannons roaring with mechanical vengeance. Hoth's panzers cut through the Soviet flanks with surgical ferocity, turning the thawing plains into graveyards of burning steel. The Red Army, stunned by the suddenness of the assault, tried to regroup but found itself encircled in pockets of fire and ice. Soldiers who had tasted triumph at Stalingrad now found themselves trapped in the same nightmare they had inflicted months before. Panic spread faster than orders could. The Wehrmacht, written off as crippled, now moved with the precision of a predator rediscovering its strength. The counteroffensive unfolded with terrifying beauty, a masterclass in mobile warfare. German divisions moved like liquid across the snow, encircling Soviet units that had advanced too far. The battlefield trembled under the rhythm of engines and the thunder of shells. From the air, the Luftwaffe returned with vengeance, its bombers tracing smoke trails over convoys and columns scattered across the white expanse. Soviet soldiers fought bravely but blindly, unable to discern direction or purpose amid the chaos. Radio operators screamed coordinates that no one could confirm. Commanders vanished in bombardments that erased entire regiments. The once proud spearheads of the Voronezh and southwestern fronts now splintered, their coherence dissolving in the blizzard of German momentum. Villages changed hands 3 times in a day, their streets buried under layers of frozen dead. It was not merely a battle. It was an execution carried out with mathematical precision, and in the heart of it all, Manstein's calm voice directed the storm. By March, the German tide had turned with astonishing speed. The Red Army's winter triumphs melted into retreat, its formations scattering back toward the Donets. In the ruins of the countryside, German troops reclaimed the blackened husks of their own supply depots, now half buried under snow. Their morale surged, fed by revenge, adrenaline, and a sudden sense of destiny regained. Hitler, hearing reports of the advance, called it a miracle born of German steel and spirit. For once, even his generals did not contradict him. The recapture of Kharkov became the symbol of resurrection, the Wehrmacht rising from the ashes of Stalingrad, proving that it still had claws. Propaganda flooded Germany with images of smiling soldiers and fluttering flags amid the rubble. But behind those images lay exhaustion, attrition, and a gnawing awareness that every victory came at diminishing cost-effectiveness. Manstein had bought breathing room, not salvation, and beneath the cheers, the whispers of overreach began again. Inside Kharkov, the battle was fought house by house, room by room, until the city itself seemed to scream. Soviet defenders clung to every corner, firing from windows shattered by artillery fire. German grenadiers advanced through smoke and debris, bayonets flashing in the dim light of burning rafters. Civilians huddled in cellars, listening to the footsteps above, the boots of one army leaving, the boots of another entering, the stench of cordite mixed with the acrid odor of frostbitten corpses. Streets once named for poets and engineers became trenches of brick and ice. By mid-March, the city was again in German hands, its silence broken only by the wind whistling through bullet-riddled walls. Victory came at a cost that could not be counted in maps alone. The soldiers who raised the swastika over the ruins did so with trembling hands, their breath visible in the frozen air. For them, triumph and terror were indistinguishable, two faces of the same unrelenting war. When the snow finally melted, what remained of Kharkov was not a city but a scar. Entire districts had vanished under bombardment, their ruins forming jagged silhouettes against the thawing sky. The streets were choked with rubble and the blackened shells of tanks. Yet amid that devastation, German troops marched with a confidence that bordered on disbelief. To the common soldier, it felt like redemption, a cleansing of the humiliation of Stalingrad, but to the officers, it was a warning cloaked in victory. The Red Army had retreated, yes, but it had not collapsed. Its losses were vast, yet its reserves were deeper still. Manstein himself, ever the realist, wrote in his diary that we have defeated an enemy who will return stronger, not weaker. And as the snow gave way to mud, the first signs of that prophecy began to stir in the east. In Berlin, the news of Kharkov's recapture spread like wildfire. Hitler celebrated it as vindication, proof that his faith in German will was unshakable, that Stalingrad had been an aberration, not a turning point. Speeches filled the air with words of destiny and divine favor, but among his generals there was silence, the silence of men who understood the mathematics of war. Every mile regained required fuel they no longer had, men they could not replace, and time they could not recover. The summer ahead would demand more than brilliance. It would demand miracles. The Wehrmacht had reclaimed its pride, but not its advantage. And as the snows of Kharkov melted into rivers flowing south toward the Don, they carried with them the memory of triumph built upon exhaustion. The German army stood once more at the edge of greatness, but beneath its boots the ground was already beginning to crack. Spring thawed the snows of Kharkov into a mire of mud and ambition. The Wehrmacht, flushed with victory, turned its gaze eastward once more, toward the Donets River, the next great barrier between them and Hitler's southern dream. Engines groaned to life in the grey dawn, sending columns of exhaust into the chill air. Tanks crept forward, their treads churning through mud that clung like tar, the sound of metal grinding against the bones of the land itself. Each kilometre gained felt heavier than the last. Each bridge crossed a gamble against time and physics. The soldiers spoke of another easy drive, but their eyes betrayed exhaustion, their faces carved by sleepless nights and diesel fumes. Fuel trucks lagged behind, bogged down in the same mud that slowed the spearheads. Mechanics worked in knee-deep sludge, their wrenches cold in trembling hands. Still, the orders remained the same: advance, always advance. and in the slow, grinding rhythm of progress, the first cracks of fatigue began to whisper through the ranks. The geography of the Donets was treacherous. Open plains broken by ravines, rivers that swelled unpredictably, and villages perched on ridges like fortresses of earth and ash. For the Germans it was both opportunity and obstacle. Panzer divisions could sweep across the grasslands with ease, but the supply convoys behind them stumbled over every rise and dip. The sound of distant artillery echoed across valleys, a reminder that the Soviets had not vanished. They were waiting. The Red Army, bloodied but wiser, no longer fought in desperation. Its retreats were measured, deliberate, drawing the Germans deeper into the labyrinth of the steppe. Minefields appeared overnight. Bridges collapsed just as armored columns reached them. Reconnaissance units reported ghost villages, abandoned by day, deadly by night. Every gain felt less like conquest and more like pursuit through an invisible maze. The landscape itself seemed to resist occupation, swallowing men, fuel, and confidence with equal hunger. Inside Hitler's headquarters, optimism still burned, bright, delusional, and detached. Reports from the front spoke of forward movement, not the cost it exacted. Maps showed black arrows racing east toward the Don, neat and clean, untouched by mud or blood. But the truth on the ground was far uglier. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers, vulnerable to every partisan ambush and fuel leak. Divisions began to cannibalize their own vehicles for spare parts, stripping engines under open skies. Field kitchens ran cold, their firewood soaked by spring rains. Soldiers ate tinned rations weeks past expiration, washing them down with bitter well water that tasted of iron and fear. The war machine that once roared like thunder now moved like a man limping, powerful but wounded. And still, Hitler demanded speed, blind to the way his empire's arteries were already beginning to clog. For the Red Army, the Donets campaign became a lesson in patience. Stalin's generals, Zhukov, Vasilevsky and Vatutin, learned to trade space for attrition. They fell back in patterns, striking at the flanks, harassing supply routes, then vanishing before the Germans could strike back. The Soviet Air Force, once battered and broken, now returned in small, disciplined formations, strafing fuel convoys, bombing bridges, then disappearing into cloud banks. German officers cursed the sky. The Soviets had turned it into their second battlefield. In the villages left behind, partisans waited with mines, Molotovs, and the kind of hatred that does not sleep. Every farmhouse became a trap, every haystack a hiding place for death. The Wehrmacht advanced, yes, but each kilometer was now contested, not by armies, but by the land and its ghosts. The Soviet retreat, though silent, was the sound of strategy reborn, and in that silence, the Red Army began to evolve into something far more dangerous. The Donets shimmered in the summer heat, wide, deceptive, and cruelly beautiful. German engineers labored to bridge it, driving pilings into mud while shells burst on the far bank. Sweat stung their eyes as they worked through nights lit by tracer fire. The Luftwaffe screamed overhead, trying to suppress Soviet artillery that raked the crossing with deadly precision. Boats capsized, pontoons burned, and men drowned silently beneath the dark surface. Yet somehow, through grit and sacrifice, the crossings held. Panzers rumbled over temporary bridges that swayed beneath their weight, leaving oily rainbows in the river's wake. On the far bank, Soviet snipers waited in reeds, patient as frost. The Germans broke through, but each success came bloodied, its cost measured not in land but in the men left behind. The Donets had been crossed, yet it felt less like victory and more like trespass. The further east they drove, the more the world itself seemed to rebel. The air grew hotter, the dust thicker, the nights colder. Engines clogged with grit. filters choked, and radiator hoses split under strain. Mechanics cursed and worked by lantern light, their hands slick with oil and despair. Fuel shortages became epidemic. Some divisions moved only at night to conserve gasoline. Ammunition ran low and artillery officers rationed shells like surgeons counting heartbeats. The men began to measure progress, not in kilometers but in hours before the next breakdown. The steppe, vast, golden and merciless, stretched ahead like eternity, and with each passing day the dream of reaching the Caucasus shimmered farther away, like a mirage that fled whenever they tried to touch it. Among the soldiers, talk turned from victory to endurance. They no longer spoke of oil fields or glory, only of rest, of shade, of home. Letters home were filled with longing and resignation, written in shaky script by hands blistered from heat and recoil. "We keep moving," one wrote, "but the earth moves against us." The scent of burning wheat hung heavy in the air as villages were torched to deny shelter to partisans. Smoke blurred the horizon into a dull orange haze, where the sun rose and set without distinction. Soviet resistance hardened in pockets, swift ambushes that vanished as soon as they struck. Each ambush left behind wrecked trucks and the echo of laughter carried on the wind. The Germans called it the invisible front, where no enemy could be seen, yet death was always near. It was not just the Red Army they fought now, but a nation learning how to survive. By midsummer, the Donets lay behind the Wehrmacht, conquered but unconquerable. The advance had not stopped, but its rhythm had slowed, its precision dulled by distance and fatigue. Commanders sent optimistic reports to Berlin, but between the lines despair seeped like oil through sand. They had reached farther east than ever before, yet every mile felt heavier, every victory smaller. The Soviet retreats no longer collapsed, they coiled, waiting for the next chance to strike. The German lines stretched thinner than nerves, their flanks guarded by allies already trembling under pressure. What had begun as triumph now carried the smell of exhaustion and the faint, bitter taste of overconfidence. The geography had become an enemy of its own, silent, vast, and patient. And as the Donets faded behind them, the soldiers could not shake the feeling that the land itself was warning them to turn back. But destiny, like the steppe, has no mercy for those who ignore its signs. July 1942, the southern horizon shimmered with heat, and the dream of the Caucasus finally took form in steel and smoke. Army Group A, under Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist, began its push toward the mountains, driving deeper than any German force had gone before. The order was clear and intoxicating: seize the oil fields of Maikop, Grozny and Baku, the lifeblood of Stalin's war machine. Columns of panzers rolled through the dust-choked valleys of the Kuban, their engines growling beneath a sun so fierce it warped the air itself. Every man knew the prize, black gold buried beneath the earth, the key to victory and survival. Maps on Kleist's desk showed the mountains like walls of promise, their snow-capped peaks a line between ambition and madness. The offensive was called Edelweiss, a name chosen to evoke purity, courage and conquest. But even before the first peaks came into view, the heat, the dust, and the endless distance began to whisper a warning. Nature had no intention of surrendering, and the farther the Germans advanced, the more the land itself began to fight back. The first phase was fast, almost effortless. Soviet resistance in the Kuban collapsed before the speed of the German assault, its defenders still reeling from the disasters along the Don. Panzers swept across the plains, crossing rivers on makeshift bridges and leaving behind columns of smoke that stretched for miles. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies once more, its bombers carving fire trails through Soviet convoys retreating toward the Caucasus foothills. Villages burned as the Wehrmacht advanced through orchards heavy with fruit. the scent of ripening apples mixing with the acrid tang of gasoline. Clay's staff reported dazzling progress. Mykop was within reach, Grozny soon to follow. Soldiers rode atop tanks, their faces streaked with sweat and dust, believing they were witnessing the rebirth of German destiny. Propaganda officers filmed it all, capturing scenes of triumph that would later be played to cheering crowds in Berlin. But behind the camera's frame, fuel shortages were already biting. The farther they moved, the emptier the fuel drums rattled, and the more fragile victory began to feel. The Caucasus rose from the horizon like a revelation, towering ridges wrapped in mist, their peaks crowned with eternal snow. For soldiers who had known only the flatness of the steppe, it was both magnificent and terrifying. Mountain roads wound like serpents through narrow passes, each bend a potential ambush, each slope a trap for engines built for plains, not peaks. German mountain divisions, the Gebirgsjäger, began their ascent, scaling terrain that even local shepherds called unforgiving. They climbed with rifles slung and ropes coiled, their boots slipping on shale slick with rain and blood. Avalanches thundered from unseen ridges, swallowing entire patrols without warning. Trucks stalled, horses slipped, and supply lines twisted into chaos under the strain. Yet still, orders came down from Kleist's headquarters. Press on, higher, faster, farther. Every meter upward was earned in exhaustion and sacrifice, and somewhere above the clouds the dream of Baku still glittered like a mirage that would not die. At Mykop, the illusion of triumph turned bitter. When German vanguards reached the oil fields in late August, they found them silent. Wells destroyed, pipelines shattered, refineries reduced to skeletal ruins. The Soviets had burned everything before retreating, leaving only smoking craters and lakes of crude that burned like liquid fire. Engineers from the Todd organization arrived with blueprints and optimism, promising repairs within weeks. But the devastation was complete. Nothing could be salvaged quickly enough to matter. Oil seeped into the soil, the stench of it clinging to the uniforms of men who had marched 1,000 kilometers to reach it. Close officers tried to conceal their disappointment in front of the troops, but word spread fast. The prize was gone, the fuel they sought now just ash and mud. Berlin demanded reports, and the reports spoke of partial successes and temporary delays. The truth was more damning. They had reached their goal, and it had turned to smoke in their hands. The dream of oil was already bleeding into the mud beneath their boots. As the advance pressed deeper into the mountains, supply became nightmare. Convoys snaked through gorges so narrow that vehicles scraped rock on both sides. Fuel trucks stalled, then burst into flames under strafing runs from Soviet planes. Horses, overloaded and starving, dropped dead in their harnesses, their bodies pushed off cliffs to clear the path. The once precise German war machine now resembled a desperate caravan, soldiers hauling ammunition on their backs, eating cold rations beside broken engines. Radios crackled with static. Communication between forward units and headquarters grew sporadic and uncertain. Soviet partisans, armed with captured rifles and local knowledge, struck supply routes with ruthless precision. Each ambush cost another day, another dozen men, another ration of fuel that could never be replaced. In the valleys below, mist clung to the forests like smoke from unseen fires. Progress became measured, not in kilometers, but in endurance. The Wehrmacht was climbing not only mountains but the slow, steep slope of its own undoing. For the Soviets, the retreat into the Caucasus was no surrender. It was strategy. Engineers and geologists had long prepared for this moment, charting the destruction of their own oil empire to deny it to the enemy. Entire fields were drenched in explosives, machinery dismantled, and workers evacuated east beyond the Caspian. In the passes above Tupubs and Nalchik, Soviet mountain troops dug in, using terrain as their greatest weapon. They fought in silence, striking from ridges and disappearing into mist, their camouflage blending with stone and shadow. Each day they delayed the Germans was a victory of time over power. The weather turned colder, the fog thicker, the mountain roads slick with rain that turned to sleet. German soldiers, once drunk on momentum, now shivered in damp uniforms and muttered prayers for sunlight. The Caucasus was no battlefield, it was a living, breathing wall of resistance. And as the first snows fell, even Kleist began to sense that his army had climbed beyond its reach. In Berlin, Hitler still saw maps, not mountains. He demanded new offensives toward Grozny, fresh reports on Baku, and speeches proclaiming inevitable success. His faith in momentum blinded him to reality. His armies were running on fumes, their engines coughing like dying animals. Kleist, ever the pragmatist, sent urgent messages pleading for fuel, reinforcements and rest. Few answers came. The logistical network that fed the offensive was stretched to breaking, dependent on single rail lines that wound through hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Every delivery took longer. Every journey carried more risk. Officers began rationing bullets, fuel, and even hope. And while propaganda celebrated the conquest of the Caucasus heights, the men in the valleys below whispered a darker truth. They had come too far, too fast, and the mountain was swallowing them whole. Ambition had outpaced reality, and reality was exacting its quiet revenge. By October, the snow on Mount Elbrus shone beneath a grey sky, and a handful of German mountain troops planted the swastika on its peak. Photographs were taken, speeches were written, and the image was broadcast as proof of victory. But the men who stood there knew it meant nothing. Below them, the valleys burned with withdrawal fires, engines froze in place, and wounded men were carried down trails that ended in rivers of mud. The offensive had reached its highest point, literally and symbolically. The dream of oil, of empire, of domination had turned to frost beneath their boots. Nature had done what no army could. It had stopped the Wehrmacht cold. The mountains of the Caucasus stood unmoved, indifferent to ambition and suffering alike, and as the winds howled through the passes, the soldiers of Army Group A began their slow descent into exhaustion, their triumph already dissolving into myth. In the distance to the north, the Volga waited, and with it the city that would decide the fate of it all. In the summer heat of 1942, as dust swirled above the steppe, and the scent of fuel hung heavy in the air, one decision sealed the fate of Germany's Eastern Empire. It began with a map, vast, hypnotic, and filled with possibilities that blurred into delusion. Hitler stood before it in his headquarters at Rastenburg, surrounded by silence and subservience. His eyes lingered over the south, where two rivers, the Volga and the Kuban, twisted like arteries across the body of the Soviet Union. "We shall take both," he declared, tracing two fingers eastward, one towards Stalingrad, the other toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. His generals hesitated. They understood what he did not, that to divide force on such a scale was to dilute it beyond salvation. The Wehrmacht was powerful, yes, but not infinite. Its tanks were stretched thin, its logistics cracking, its soldiers exhausted from months of ceaseless advance. Yet no one dared to object, and so the command was written. The map split in two, and with it, the German summer offensive broke its spine. Operation Blue, once a singular, cohesive strike, now fractured into two divergent ambitions. Army Group B under Friedrich Paulus was ordered northward towards Stalingrad, a city whose name would soon consume Germany's soul. Army Group A under Ewald von Kleist was to surge south toward the Caucasus, to claim the oil fields that glimmered like mirages in the desert heat. What had been one blade now became two, each cutting away from the other. Coordination vanished, replaced by confusion across distances too vast for even the most disciplined army to bridge. Luftwaffe squadrons were split between two skies, fuel convoys rerouted, and communication lines tangled into chaos. The rhythm of blitzkrieg, that deadly symphony of speed and cohesion, disintegrated into dissonance. Field commanders grumbled in code, their frustration buried beneath reports of progress. The fronts moved like strangers, unaware of one another's struggles, and as the lines grew longer, the cracks beneath them began to widen into canyons. In the headquarters of the Sixth Army, Paulus studied his new orders with the calm precision of a man trained to obey rather than challenge. His task was monumental: to take Stalingrad, to secure the Volga, to sever the Soviet Union's southern arteries. He knew it was madness. He knew it was madness. The city's name alone carried the weight of defiance, and its position on the Volga made it a fortress of geography and pride. Yet the command was absolute, and Paulus was a man of absolute discipline. He gathered his officers, unfurled his maps, and began the arithmetic of conquest: divisions, tonnage, flight hours, ammunition counts. Every calculation led to the same conclusion. It was possible only if the southern flank held, if Kleist succeeded. That connection, however, had already begun to fray. The further south Army Group A drove, the less support Paulus could expect, and the more his army would stand exposed on an ever-thinning thread. Duty eclipsed doubt, and with measured calm Paulus signed the orders that would march his men toward the Volga and into the jaws of fate. Far to the south, Kleist faced his own impossible command. Hitler demanded that his tanks cross the Caucasus, seize Maikup, Grozny, and push to Baku. 1,000 kilometers of mountains, rivers, and defiance. It was a fantasy drawn in ink, but paid for in blood. Kleist's columns stretched endlessly through the Kuban region, their supply lines trailing like arteries open to every wound. Bridges buckled under their weight, fuel convoys vanished under partisan ambushes, and the mountains loomed ever higher, colder, crueler. Every kilometer gained weakened his ability to hold the next. Yet when reports reached Berlin, they spoke of progress, not peril. Kleist's pleas for consolidation were dismissed as pessimism. "Drive on," came the reply. And so the field marshal drove on, deeper into terrain that cared nothing for orders or dreams, only for gravity, distance, and exhaustion. In Berlin, Hitler's obsession grew feverish. He saw the war not as logistics, but as will, a contest of faith, of his personal strength against the weight of the earth. When his generals spoke of supply lines, he spoke of destiny. When they warned of attrition, he spoke of German spirit. He believed that boldness could conquer nature, that the same gamble that had triumphed in France could bend Russia to his will. But the Eastern Front was not France. It was a continent that devoured ambition, one that turned boldness into blindness. From his wolf's lair, Hitler micromanaged divisions hundreds of miles apart, issuing contradictory orders to commanders who could no longer communicate effectively. Army Group A needed support it would never receive. Army Group B fought battles Hitler refused to acknowledge, and between them the great empty plains of the steppe stretched like a graveyard waiting to be filled. The map was still beautiful in theory and fatal in practice. The consequences rippled outward like cracks in ice. The Luftwaffe, tasked with covering both fronts, could no longer maintain air superiority over either. Bombers were stretched thin, fighter squadrons exhausted, and supply flights forced to choose which starving army to serve. Fuel shortages grew catastrophic. At depots, Tank crews siphoned gasoline from trucks, meant for Kleist's columns just to keep moving. The once unstoppable blitzkrieg now advanced at walking pace, its engines coughing, its precision blunted by hunger and distance. Commanders found themselves improvising daily, rerouting entire corps to patch holes that never closed. Soviet forces, once fleeing, now began to sense opportunity. Their scouts reported gaps, their commanders plotted counterblows. The invincible machine of 1941 had fractured into two wounded beasts, still dangerous, but bleeding fast. For the soldiers, the split felt like a betrayal. Men who once fought side by side now marched toward different horizons, their radios filled with static and rumors. They spoke of Stalingrad with dread, of the mountains with disbelief. Why both? They asked, though no one answered. Convoys passed one another in silence, one heading north toward the Volga, the other south toward the clouds. The steppe seemed endless, featureless and merciless, offering neither shade nor sense. Letters from home took months to arrive, often carrying words from loved ones already gone. The war, once a crusade of purpose, had become a wandering. Yet amid fatigue and confusion, they obeyed. They always obeyed, and as the horizon divided, so too did their faith in victory. By autumn, the split was complete. Physical, strategic, and spiritual. Two great armies moved in opposite directions, neither strong enough to support the other, both bound to fail by design. The lines of communication that once pulsed with clarity now flickered with delay and contradiction. To the north, Pallas stared into the Inferno of Stalingrad. To the south, Kleist stared into the frozen face of the Caucasus. Between them lay hundreds of miles of emptiness, a gulf filled only with fuel shortages, burned bridges, and dead men. Hitler still believed he could command both from afar, his voice reaching across radios like an echo that grew weaker each day. The Wehrmacht had not been defeated yet, but it was no longer whole. Ambition had torn it apart more thoroughly than any enemy could, and as the autumn winds swept across the plains, the seeds of disaster were already sown, carried silently toward the Volga, where destiny waited with open arms. August 1942. The sun hung low over the Caucasus, casting long shadows across valleys that shimmered with dust and distance. The air smelled of pine and oil, of rain not yet fallen, of a war that had come too far. German mountain divisions wound their way through the passes, their rifles clattering against rock, their lungs burning thin in the high air. Above them loomed Mount Elbrus, a silent titan watching the futility below. To Berlin, it was a symbol, the highest peak in Europe, a prize for propaganda, a beacon of ambition. To the men climbing it, it was just another order, another absurd task in a war that no longer made sense. They climbed with numb fingers and hollow bellies, planting the swastika in ice that would outlast the Reich itself. Cameras clicked. Officers saluted and dispatches were sent proclaiming victory at the roof of Europe. Yet beneath that frozen flag, engines stalled, fuel ran dry, and the front lines below began to unravel. The summit belonged to Germany for a moment, and to history forever. Below the mountains, the offensive that had once moved like fire was now crawling through mud and fear. The drive toward Grozny had stalled, its supply lines strangled by geography and the relentless hand of Soviet resistance. Rivers that had seemed small on maps now swelled into barriers of rain and rock, trucks overturned on narrow roads spilling crates of ammunition into ravines where scavengers later picked them clean. Horses slipped on shale and vanished into fog. The mountain wind howled through the columns, carrying with it the echo of artillery from valleys far away. Soviet gunners dug into ridgelines invisible from below turned every advance into an ambush. The sound of explosions rolled down the slopes like thunder that never stopped. Men began to measure days not by victories but by the number of engines that still worked. And though Berlin demanded speed, the mountains answered only with silence. Field Marshal Kleist read the reports in his command tent near the Terek River, his hands blackened with dust and despair. The fuel reserves were nearly gone. What tanks remained crawled like insects over broken terrain, advancing kilometers at a time, only to stop for lack of gasoline. The once proud panzer divisions had become immobile fortresses, powerful but stranded, their armor gleaming uselessly in the sun. Kleist sent message after message to the high command, pleading for resupply, for reprieve, for reason. The replies were empty slogans from a world untouched by mud or fear. Press forward. The Caucasus must be taken at all costs. Around him, the officers looked away as if not to share his helplessness. Even victories now came wrapped in futility, each hill taken costing fuel enough to cross 10 more, and beyond every ridge, the mountains multiplied, endless, indifferent, eternal. For the Soviets, the Caucasus had become sacred ground. They knew its valleys, its rivers, its sharp turns where the fog concealed ambushes like old ghosts. Men from Georgia, Armenia, and Chechnya fought, not as soldiers of Stalin's empire but as defenders of their own soil. They moved through the forests with quiet precision, laying mines beneath bridges and detonating explosives where convoys were most vulnerable. German patrols reported attacks that seemed to come from nowhere, a shot from the trees, a mine in the road, a whisper of movement followed by silence. In the skies above, Soviet pilots flew antiquated planes patched with tin, strafing supply depots and vanishing behind cloud cover. It was a war of patience, and the Soviets were masters of endurance. Stalin's orders were clear: hold the passes, deny the oil, bleed them dry. The Caucasus became not a line of defense, but a living trap, and in its shadows the myth of German momentum began to die. At the front, the mountains played tricks with the senses. Sound bounced off stone until gunfire seemed to come from everywhere at once. Nights were so cold that rifles froze to men's hands, yet the days burned with heat that cracked lips and split skin. Avalanche and ambush shared the same sound, the roar of something unstoppable descending from above. German soldiers slept in caves and churches, carving swastikas into wooden doors they would never see again. They wrote home about paradise turned to hell, about mountains that swallowed their friends whole. Food was scarce and water came from streams thick with ash. The air smelled of resin and decay. Every day felt smaller, the scope of the war shrinking from continents to mere survival on a single peak. And somewhere in the fog, the Soviets waited, patient as the stones themselves. On the plains below, the Terek River marked the outermost reach of Germany's power and the beginning of its collapse. The drive toward Grozny faltered amid scorched oil fields and unending counterattacks. Soviet engineers had destroyed every refinery, flooded every well, and poisoned the soil with crude. Even if captured, they would have yielded nothing but blackened earth. The Luftwaffe tried to break the deadlock, bombing Soviet positions until the very air smelled of sulfur and iron. But their fuel too was running out, their reach shrinking as the front lines stretched thin. Each mission that left a German airfield required calculations, not of target accuracy, but of whether the planes could make it back. Below, the tanks grew still, their crews waiting for orders that never came. And along the Terek, where the water ran dark with oil, the reality became undeniable. The gates of the Caucasus had closed. Back in Berlin, the photographs of Mount Elbrus circulated through propaganda offices. Triumphant images of flags and glory, they showed none of the rot behind them. Hitler, thrilled by the symbolism, ordered the pictures published across Europe. calling it a sign of German mastery over nature. His generals were silent. They knew it was a hollow gesture, a victory of optics masking the collapse of strategy. The swastika atop Elbrus had cost no lives to plant but thousands to defend. Even as it fluttered against the high winds, its meaning was empty, a monument to arrogance. The men below, hungry and cold, stared up at the peak and saw not triumph but distance. The mountains seemed to mock them, gleaming white above the black scars of war. In that contrast lay the truth of the campaign. The higher they climbed, the farther they fell. By late autumn the snows came early, burying ambition beneath a white silence. The passes froze, the engines seized, and the routes to Grozny and Baku became impassable. Kleist's divisions dug in, building makeshift shelters out of wrecked vehicles and timber scavenged from burned villages. Orders from Berlin still demanded progress, but the only direction left was backward. The dream of reaching the oil fields had vanished into smoke, leaving only exhaustion and frostbite in its wake. In the mountains, silence settled like a verdict. The men who had raised their flag above Europe's highest peak now stared at a horizon they would never conquer. Snowflakes drifted down, erasing the footprints of an army that had once believed itself invincible. And as the winter closed its grip around the Caucasus, the echoes of their ambition faded into the wind. A whisper carried northward, towards Stalingrad, where another greater reckoning awaited. July 1942, the German army turned east again, its engines humming like a swarm of locusts over the burning plains of southern Russia. The land stretched endlessly ahead, flat, shimmering and cruel under the furnace of the sun. Dust rose in thick waves behind every column, choking men and machines alike, clinging to sweat and oil and breath. It coated lips, rifles and dreams with the same dry bitterness. The road toward the Volga seemed eternal, the horizon a mirage that retreated with every mile gained. Men fought thirst as fiercely as they fought the enemy, rationing water in tin cups and praying for shade that never came. Fuel convoys stretched for kilometers, snaking across terrain that swallowed tires and ambition. Villages along the way lay burned, their wells poisoned, their streets silent except for the distant buzz of flies. The offensive no longer felt like momentum, it felt like pursuit through a graveyard. And somewhere beyond that shimmering haze waited a city whose name would soon eclipse all others. The name was Stalingrad, once just another dot on a map, now the magnet for every thought in Hitler's mind. It was not merely a target, it was a symbol. To seize the city that bore Stalin's name would, he believed, break the Soviet spirit and crown his summer campaign in glory. Geography added logic to the obsession. Stalingrad sat astride the Volga, the artery that fed the Soviet South with fuel, food and steel. But ideology made it madness. Hitler saw conquest not as a military goal but as a personal duel, a contest between names carved into history. In his headquarters he traced his finger along the river again and again, whispering to aides, "It must fall." His generals hesitated. They knew the cost of turning a map into a shrine, but the orders came regardless, unyielding and absolute. And so, as July gave way to August, the full weight of Army Group B turned toward the city of destiny. The journey to Stalingrad was a descent into fire and dust. The steppe stretched wide as the sea, dotted with villages reduced to ash by retreating Soviet forces. Roads disintegrated under the heat, wagons sank into powder, and soldiers marched through horizons blurred by mirage. The sun hammered down without mercy, turning helmets into furnaces and uniforms into rags. In the distance, Soviet columns retreated with grim precision, burning fuel depots, dynamiting bridges, leaving nothing alive. German pursuit was relentless but weary, every victory purchased at the cost of motion itself. Supply lines lagged, fuel depots grew thin, and trucks ran half empty to conserve what little remained. The Luftwaffe circled overhead, its engines growling like predators waiting to strike. From above, the advance looked clean. From below, it was suffocating chaos. And through it all, the word Stalingrad echoed through the ranks like a spell, drawing them onward into the heat. By mid-August, the city's outline appeared through the haze, a grey smudge against the blazing horizon, its skyline rising from the steppe like a mirage of stone and smoke. The Volga glinted behind it, a silver blade cutting through the vast plain. For the soldiers who saw it first, there was awe and disbelief. After months of movement, the destination finally had shape, though its silence was ominous. Reconnaissance flights reported heavy defences, barbed wire, artillery emplacements, and bunkers dug deep into the earth. Soviet troops had not fled this time, they had prepared. General Vasily Zhukov's 62nd Army waited across the river, its ranks thin but unyielding. Stalin's orders were uncompromising. Not one step back. To the Germans it looked like another city to take. To the Soviets it was the last line before annihilation. And as both sides prepared, the skies began to darken, not with clouds but with wings. On August 23rd, 1942, the Luftwaffe began its assault, a storm of steel and flame that turned the sky black by noon. Bombers appeared in waves, hundreds at a time, their engines roaring like the end of the world. The first strikes fell on the northern suburbs, and within minutes Stalingrad was burning. Oil depots erupted, their flames reaching 50 meters into the air. Factories exploded, sending molten metal into the streets. Civilians fled toward the Volga, their shadows flickering against walls that crumbled under pressure waves. The city's oxygen turned to fire. German pilots described the view below as a sea of flame, while Soviet survivors remembered it as the day the sky fell. Within hours, 40,000 civilians were dead, buried under rubble or consumed by fire. When the smoke cleared, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a ruin waiting for soldiers to die in it. The bombardment should have broken the city. It did not. Beneath the ashes, the Soviet defense took root like something primal. Soldiers crawled out of basements, dug trenches through rubble, and turned every building into a fortress. Civilians who survived the fires joined the defense. Old men, women, even children carrying ammunition through collapsing streets. The Volga ferries, under constant attack, kept bringing reinforcements from the east. Each crossing was a death sentence, yet they came night after night, slipping through flames and artillery to keep the city alive. Zhukov moved his headquarters into a bunker on the riverbank, commanding through static and chaos. "There is no land beyond the Volga," he said, and his words became law. For every meter the Germans advanced, the Soviets built another wall of flesh and stone. Stalingrad did not fall. It hardened. From the German perspective, it was supposed to be over quickly, another city captured, another banner raised, but as August bled into September, the battle became something else entirely. Every street corner, every window, every sewer became an ambush. Tanks were trapped in rubble-choked alleys. Snipers turned factories into cathedrals of death. The Luftwaffe bombed until no square meter remained intact, yet still the defenders would not die. The city devoured machinery, men and morale alike. Dust turned to mud as the Volga's mist mingled with ash, coating every soldier in the same grey exhaustion. Commanders tried to measure progress in blocks rather than miles. "We take a house," one officer wrote, "then lose it an hour later." The rhythm of war changed from movement to attrition, from blitzkrieg to endurance. And the longer it dragged on, the clearer it became that Stalingrad was no longer a battle. It was a vortex. By the first days of September, the city burned day and night, its skyline a jagged crown of ruin. The Volga gleamed beneath a haze of smoke, reflecting the glow of fires that never went out. The German advance had reached its destination but not its victory. Behind them stretched hundreds of kilometers of fragile supply lines. Ahead lay a labyrinth that consumed everything that entered it. The soldiers who had marched across the steppe now fought for staircases, doorways and cellars. The Luftwaffe's firepower had given them ruins, not triumph. Stalingrad was supposed to be a gateway. Instead, it became a graveyard under construction, and as the sun set over the burning city, the Volga carried its reflection downstream like a river of blood. The road to Stalingrad had ended, but the battle for it had only just begun, and in that infernal glow history shifted, quietly, irreversibly, forever. Late August 1942. Stalingrad burned beneath a sky the color of blood and smoke. The Luftwaffe's bombardment had transformed the once living city into a pyre that blazed for days without rest. Entire districts vanished under firestorms so fierce they created their own wind, sucking oxygen from cellars where civilians gasped for air. Asphalt melted. Glass ran down walls like water. Tram lines glowed red before sagging into molten puddles. The roar of flame was louder than any artillery, a continuous growl that drowned out the screams beneath it. People fled toward the Volga, carrying what they could: a child, a coat, a photograph already curling from the heat. Those who reached the river found it boiling with debris and bodies, the water blackened by oil, lit by falling embers. Above it all, the sound of bombers echoed like iron thunder, endless, unmerciful, absolute. The city was no longer a place, but a wound, and within that wound something unyielding began to awaken. Inside the Inferno, civilians became shadows, moving through smoke as if through another world. Entire families crowded into basements, their faces illuminated by the red light seeping through cracks in the rubble. Mothers wet rags to cover their children's mouths. Fathers dug through debris with bare hands to find survivors. The air reeked of gasoline and fear. Overhead, the buildings groaned as if alive, their steel bones twisting from the heat. In one hospital, nurses carried the wounded to the riverbank, only to find the ferries already sunk by air raids. The Volga itself burned slick with oil and corpses. In the midst of it all, a young girl clutched a doll whose dress had caught fire, a single image that captured the soul of a city dying but not surrendering. The flames devoured everything except defiance, and in that defiance the first seeds of Stalingrad's resistance took root. For General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, the destruction was a spectacle of triumph. From his forward observation post west of the city, he watched through binoculars as smoke coiled upward. Convinced the Soviet defense was broken, the bombardment, he believed, had accomplished what no army could. It had erased the city itself. To him, Stalingrad was already conquered in all but name. His staff officers agreed, their confidence fueled by radio reports of crumbling Soviet positions and prisoners streaming from the outskirts. "One more push," Paulus said quietly, "and the Volga will be ours." But his optimism was built on illusion. Beneath the ruins, beneath the smoke, the Red Army still lived, scattered, buried but alive. The city he thought destroyed was about to become the most impenetrable fortress in modern warfare, and its defenders were not retreating, they were waiting. In the basements and factories along the river, Soviet survivors reorganized. General Vasily Zhukov, now in command of the 62nd Army, arrived across the Volga under shell fire, carrying nothing but maps and an unshakable resolve. He set up his headquarters in a dugout near the riverbank, So close to the front he could hear the German artillery breathe. His first order was brutal and simple. We will hold the city or die in it. Communications were erratic. Ammunition was scarce. Morale teetered on despair. Yet somehow the will to resist hardened into something sacred. Soldiers moved through tunnels and alleys like ghosts, emerging to strike before vanishing into the ruins. Every street became a front line, every building a fortress. Civilians dug trenches beside soldiers, turning shovels into weapons of defiance. The city had ceased to live, but it refused to die. To the German infantry, the assault on Stalingrad was unlike anything they had ever seen. Streets that looked empty during the day came alive with gunfire at dusk. Buildings collapsed, but their cellars kept fighting. Snipers hunted officers from windows blackened by soot, each shot echoing like judgment. Machine guns flashed from the darkness, and grenades rolled out of nowhere. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the Ratten War, a fight not for territory, but for every corner, every shadow. Progress was measured in meters, not kilometers, and each meter cost blood. Soldiers advanced through floors of concrete and ash, killing men they never saw, dying for rooms whose names they would never know. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, as silent as the dust that filled their lungs, and with each passing hour the ruins became not a prize, but a trap. The Luftwaffe continued its bombardment, but the very destruction it caused turned against the Germans. The city's infrastructure collapsed, yes, but so did its clarity. Streets vanished under debris. Maps became useless. Tanks found themselves trapped in rubble that was once asphalt. The Soviets, fighting from basements and collapsed stairwells, now used the terrain as armor. Artillery shells detonated harmlessly against ruins already pulverized by earlier strikes. The air was thick with dust that never settled, turning day into perpetual dusk. For every German shell that fell, a dozen Soviet rifles answered from unseen corners. The smoke blurred friend and foe until combat became instinct, chaos and terror. What had begun as a bombardment of annihilation became the birth of a nightmare, and Stalingrad, once the target, now turned predator. At night the Volga glowed faintly under the reflection of the fires, a river of shadow and flame. Soviet ferries crossed under the cover of smoke, bringing reinforcements and ammunition through curtains of tracer fire. Many were sunk before reaching shore, their passengers swallowed by the current, but still they came. The roar of engines mixed with the cries of the wounded and the thunder of artillery, blending into a symphony of endurance. Zhukov's soldiers whispered that the river itself had become their lifeline, a liquid artery connecting them to hope. Across its far bank fresh divisions gathered, waiting for their chance to cross into the Inferno. German observers watched through binoculars but could not comprehend such madness that anyone would row willingly into hell. Yet they did every night without fail. The Volga ran red and black, its surface shimmering with oil and courage, and as long as it flowed the city would live. By September's end, the firestorms had cooled into embers, but the battle burned hotter than ever. The Germans held 3/4 of the city, yet victory slipped further from their grasp each day. The Soviets clung to the riverbank, their territory measured in basements and ruins, their spirits unbroken. Paulus believed he was close. One more assault, one final push. But the ruins themselves had become alive with resistance. Every bomb crater hid a sniper. Every collapsed wall concealed a machine gun. Stalingrad had turned into a labyrinth where no conqueror could breathe. Above the city, the smoke drifted eastward, carrying the ashes of the dead across the endless steppe. And as night fell once more over the burning ruins, even the Germans could sense it. This was no longer a battle for ground. but for destiny itself. The city still burned, but now the fire was within its defenders. The ruins of Stalingrad had become a living creature, one that breathed smoke, swallowed men, and devoured armies whole. The German Sixth Army entered its body not as conquerors but as prey in a maze of concrete and ash. Every wall hid a weapon, every shadow a heartbeat. The streets no longer connected. They fractured, collapsed, and funneled soldiers into kill zones shaped by chaos. Artillery thundered constantly, but the echoes confused friend and foe alike, making orientation impossible. Dust drifted through the air like snow, settling on corpses that had become landmarks. Communication lines were shredded, orders reduced to hand signals and shouts drowned by explosions. The front was now measured in stairwells, doorways, and factory floors slick with blood. Soldiers fought not for the city, but for the next room. And as the weeks ground on, Stalingrad ceased to resemble a battle. It became an anatomy of destruction. The German infantry, trained for movement and precision, found itself trapped in immobility. Each building was a fortress. Each advance, measured in meters, bought at terrible cost. Snipers watched from shattered windows, their scopes glinting like eyes of ghosts. Flamethrowers swept hallways, igniting paint and flesh in the same breath. Grenades rolled through doorways like punctuation marks in an endless sentence of death. Men crawled through holes blasted in walls to avoid open streets, their boots crunching over glass and bone. The smell of cordite and smoke never left their clothes, seeping into skin and thought. Officers tried to mark progress on maps that no longer matched the ground. Daylight offered no clarity. Only new shadows, new screams, new ruins. The Sixth Army was no longer advancing. It was dissolving, one house at a time. For the Soviets, the city had become their element. A vast, broken landscape where the weak were filtered out and the fearless thrived. Vasily Zhukov's 62nd Army fought with the logic of survival, improvising with whatever remained. Machine guns were mounted on desks, mines hidden in ovens, rifles fired through holes in collapsed ceilings. Entire regiments operated from single factories, the walls painted with slogans scrawled in chalk and blood. Every step must be paid for, Zhukov declared, and his men took the words as law. Women carried ammunition through sniper fire, teenagers manned machine guns, and workers repaired rifles with tools salvaged from burnt workshops. The Germans had tanks, the Soviets had proximity, the desperate intimacy of defenders who refused to yield an inch. Every ruin became sacred ground, defended until it vanished under bombardment, and when it did, another ruin took its place. Combat collapsed into something primitive, war stripped of maneuver and technology, reduced to instinct and proximity. Men killed each other with shovels, rebar, bayonets, and bricks. In the shattered stairwells of apartment blocks, screams mixed with prayers, curses, and the ragged sound of breathing. Soldiers grappled in the dark, their faces inches apart, their rifles useless in spaces too small to raise them. Grenades burst inside rooms barely large enough for 4 men, leaving walls slick with fragments of flesh and plaster. Fire consumed oxygen faster than lungs could draw it. Those who survived stumbled outside only to find the next floor waiting, the next fight beginning, the next silence ending. The city devoured logic. It ran on adrenaline, smoke, and inevitability. Victory was no longer measured by ground taken, but by who remained standing when the dust cleared. Snipers ruled the air between buildings, invisible gods of death, who turned every step into a gamble. German officers fell in doorways with neat holes between their eyes, their bodies folding as if in prayer. Soviet sharpshooters moved silently through attics and rafters, their rifles wrapped in rags to muffle sound, their patience measured in hours. Names like Zaitsev and Chekhov spread through the ranks like folklore, half truth, half myth. The Germans sent counter-snipers, but the ruins favored the patient, not the powerful. Whole patrols vanished without a sound, their rifles later found buried under snow or sandbags. Fear settled in the stomachs of men who once feared nothing, a new kind of paralysis born not from defeat, but from anticipation. Even whispers could draw fire. At night, both sides moved like ghosts, their footsteps lost in the endless echo of the dead. The city was watching, and its eyes never blinked. Factories became citadels. The Red October, the Barricade, and the tractor plant, once engines of Soviet industry, were now fortresses of smoke and iron. Workers who had built tanks in those halls now fired them from the same assembly lines. Machine tools stood beside machine guns. Molten metal glowed red beside blood. German troops advancing through these industrial cathedrals found themselves fighting amid sparks, wires, and shadows that hid entire platoons. The roar of artillery outside merged with the clang of steel within, creating a sound like the heartbeat of hell. Overhead, cranes hung motionless, their hooks swaying in air thick with soot. The smell of oil and death was inseparable. These factories meant to build the future, now manufactured only death, and through it all the Soviet flag still fluttered, tattered but unfallen, over the roofs that no longer existed. The German soldiers wrote home about the city, with a kind of awe, not admiration but disbelief. "Stalingrad is not a city," one wrote, "it is a furnace." Another described the nights. "You can hear them breathing through the walls." Sleep became rare, food scarcer, and clean water a luxury. Medics set up aid stations in sewers, treating the wounded beside rivers of filth and blood. Command posts changed hands daily, their coordinates meaningless by the time they were transmitted. German field kitchens were obliterated. Soldiers scavenged Soviet rations from corpses. The morale that had carried them across half of Europe now sagged under the weight of exhaustion and fear. Still, Pulse insisted the city was nearly his, nearly finished. But Stalingrad was not a place that could be finished. For the civilians who still lived among the ruins, survival became an act of faith. They hid in basements beneath collapsing floors, sharing water drawn from the Volga and the quiet company of the dying. Children played with shell casings, their laughter swallowed by gunfire. Women boiled wallpaper for its glue, anything to fill their stomachs. The German leaflets promising mercy fluttered through the streets, singed at the edges by falling ash. No one believed them anymore. Amid the chaos, small kindnesses persisted. A soldier sharing bread with a mother, a nurse holding the hand of a dying stranger. It was humanity's faintest echo, flickering amid the roar. And yet even those moments were stolen by the next blast, the next firestorm, the next scream. Stalingrad had become both tomb and testament, a place where civilization itself seemed to test how much suffering it could bear. As October approached, the German Sixth Army was still fighting, still advancing, but the line between victory and annihilation had vanished. The city beneath them was no longer theirs to take. It had already claimed them. Every soldier who entered Stalingrad now belonged to it, body and soul. The maps on Pulse's table still showed progress, but the reality outside his tent was decay. Supplies dwindled. Winter whispered across the steppe, and the Volga, far from being conquered, shimmered beyond reach. The ruins themselves fought harder than any army ever had. In the glow of burning factories, the snow began to fall, hissing as it touched flame. The men looked upward, but there was no sky, only smoke. And as the first frost crept through the broken streets, the Inferno gave way to silence but not peace. For in that silence, the trap of Stalingrad was beginning to close. The steppe lay silent beneath the November sky, vast, wind-bitten, and cold enough to still breath itself. The horizon stretched flat and endless, concealing within its emptiness an empire's secret. Trains moved through the darkness without lights, their wheels grinding against frozen rails that screamed softly into the night. From the Urals to the Don, from the Volga to the Caucasus, the Soviet Union was gathering strength in the shadows. Entire armies were on the move, but no one spoke of it aloud. Soldiers traveled in silence, their uniforms stiff with frost, their faces hidden under scarves and resolve. Even the stars seemed muted, as if the heavens themselves had been sworn to secrecy. Beneath the snow, engines idled under camouflage nets, their warmth seeping through the ice in ghostly patterns. For months the world had believed the Red Army broken, exhausted, bled white. But beyond the reach of German maps the storm was already forming. In Moscow, the halls of the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, thrummed with the gravity of what was to come. Maps covered entire walls, rivers marked in blue pencil, arrows sketched and erased, then drawn again with darker conviction. Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky stood over them, their breath visible in the cold of an unheated room. They spoke in low tones, trading glances that carried the weight of a nation's survival. Not at the city, Zhukov said, tapping a finger to the flanks north and south of Stalingrad. Here we strike. The plan would be called Operation Uranus, a code name chosen to sound distant and impersonal, hiding its magnitude behind astronomy. It was not a frontal assault but a vast encirclement designed to crush the German Sixth Army from the sides. To succeed, it would require precision, patience, and absolute secrecy. Every move had to be hidden beneath a mask of exhaustion. Every heartbeat had to whisper, "We are beaten," until the day they struck. Far to the front, that illusion was perfect. German intelligence saw only the tattered remains of the Soviet 62nd and 64th, armies clinging to the ruins of Stalingrad. Reconnaissance flights photographed endless steppe, blank and quiet, unaware that beneath the snow the Red Army was coiling. Every night more troops arrived, Siberian riflemen hardened by Arctic winds, Kazakh cavalry from the plains and tank brigades rolling westward under the cover of darkness. Their tracks were brushed from the snow before dawn. Ammunition crates were buried in frozen fields, fuel stored in cellars of abandoned villages, artillery hidden under straw and frost. Local peasants carried supplies in sleighs, their faces blank, their silence absolute. Even German patrols that ventured north or south found nothing but wind and white emptiness. The deception was complete, the calm before a cataclysm no one could yet see. And within that calm, every Soviet soldier waited, counting down to the order that would change the war. The front lines themselves were a masquerade of fatigue. Soviet soldiers along the Volga pretended to falter, sending false radio transmissions about dwindling ammunition, shattered morale, and non-existent retreats. German intercepts brimmed with confidence, their officers convinced the Soviets were weeks from collapse. The Wehrmacht believed it had crushed its enemy, and yet behind those exhausted voices entire armies were assembling. The southwestern front under Vatutin, the Don front under Rokossovsky, the Stalingrad front under Yeremenko. More than 1 million men were being positioned across 400 kilometers of frozen steppe. They moved only at night, guided by moonlight and discipline. Artillery was rolled into position by horse, its wheels muffled with rags. Even whispers were forbidden. Even fires were banned. The silence was total, the deception flawless. The Germans saw nothing. The earth, it seemed, had gone still. At the core of the plan lay genius born of necessity. Zhukov and Vasilevsky understood that direct assault was suicide. The Germans were too entrenched, their defences too deep, but their flanks, held by Romanian and Italian divisions stretched thin across open terrain, were vulnerable. These men, underfed, undertrained, and poorly equipped for the cold, guarded an empire's weak point. It was there that the Soviets would strike, not at strength, but at hubris. Zhukov's mind moved with mathematical precision. He saw the battle as geometry, every angle sharpened by logic and inevitability. Two great pincers, one from the north, one from the south, would converge west of Stalingrad, and close like the jaws of iron. The encirclement would trap hundreds of thousands of Axis troops inside the frozen basin of the Volga. "It will be a cauldron," Vasilevsky said quietly, "and they will burn inside it." Zhukov only nodded. He knew, once begun, it could not be stopped. The Red Army prepared as if for Judgment Day. Soldiers dug foxholes in silence, the sound of shovels swallowed by snow. Mechanics worked by moonlight, thawing engines with bonfires of scrap wood and prayer. Artillerymen adjusted their sights by touch, calibrating for distances they could not see. Medics laid out bandages in neat, endless rows. Commissars read letters from home to keep morale alive, though most were written by wives and mothers who would never see their men again. At supply depots, vodka was rationed for courage, not celebration. And through it all the snow fell, soft, patient, relentless, covering everything in a deceptive calm. To the west, German soldiers dug their own trenches, oblivious to the scale of what gathered beyond their horizon. Their fires glowed faintly against the night. None of them knew they were already surrounded, not yet in geography but in fate. In Moscow, Stalin received the final briefings in silence. The dictator, once known for his interference, now allowed his generals to lead. He listened as Zhukov traced the arcs of encirclement across the map, his thick fingers trembling slightly over the Volga. "Do it," Stalin said finally, his voice flat, his eyes unreadable. The decision was both revenge and resurrection. The ghost of 1941, the retreat, the humiliation, the burning of Moscow, hovered like smoke behind his words. Outside the Kremlin, snow fell against the city's blacked-out streets, muffling even the sound of its own descent. In that moment, Stalin ceased to think of Stalingrad as a city. It was now a symbol of eternity, something to be defended at any cost, avenged without hesitation. When the meeting ended, the generals saluted and the door closed behind them like a seal. The counteroffensive of history was set in motion. The night before the storm, the steppe was unnaturally still. Soldiers stood by their guns, wrapped in blankets stiff with frost, listening to the wind sweep across the plains. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Germans were sleeping, their sentries stamping their feet to keep warm. Above them, the stars glimmered faintly through the haze, ancient witnesses to a moment that would reshape the world. At 5 o'clock hours on November 19th, the silence broke. Thousands of guns spoke at once, their thunder rolling across the earth like a heartbeat returning to life. The snow leapt from the ground with every impact. The horizon turned to flame. From the north and south, the Soviet tide surged forward, unstoppable, elemental, infinite. And as the sky burned red over Stalingrad, the world realized what the Germans had not, that the city was never the true target. The trap had been set, and the storm had begun. November 1942 arrived like a hammer blow from the frozen sky. The winds across the steppe turned sharp enough to cut breath itself, carrying snow that swirled around the ruins of Stalingrad like a shroud. The ground, once alive with the thunder of tanks, now trembled beneath the march of the Red Army. From north and south, the Soviet pincers began their inexorable convergence, meeting resistance, shattering it, and pressing on through the storm. At dawn on November 23rd, in the small town of Kalak-on-Don, the jaws closed. Two Soviet tank corps met head-on, their commanders dismounting to shake hands amid the wreckage of frozen vehicles. In that gesture, history shifted. The trap had shut. 300,000 Axis soldiers, Germans, Romanians, Italians, Hungarians, now found themselves encircled in a steel ring nearly 100 kilometers wide. The once invincible Sixth Army was no longer an army, it was prey. Inside the pocket, confusion reigned before understanding settled like frost. Radios sputtered, messages crossed, and disbelief turned to dread. Men peered across the steppe, realizing that the horizon, once their path forward, had become their prison wall. Snow covered everything now, masking the trenches, the roads, the bodies of those who had fallen too soon. Paulus's command staff huddled around maps illuminated by lantern light, tracing lines that no longer existed. Orders from Berlin came through the static, demanding hold positions and await relief. The words felt like madness, even as they were obeyed. Officers whispered of breakout, of moving west before the ring tightened beyond escape. Outside, engines coughed in the cold, and soldiers watched the horizon for help that would never come. The steppe, wide and pitiless, closed its arms around them like a grave. General Friedrich Paulus, meticulous and restrained, faced the moment with the calm of a man drowning slowly. His instinct told him to break out, to gather what fuel remained, abandon the wounded, and strike west while there was still time. But in the Führer's headquarters, far from the wind and the blood, another vision prevailed. The Sixth Army will stand fast, Hitler ordered. Stalingrad must be held at all costs. He saw the encirclement not as disaster but as opportunity, a temporary setback soon to be reversed by willpower alone. Paulus hesitated, torn between military logic and obedience to command. To disobey was treason, to obey was suicide. His staff urged him to act, their voices rising with desperation that could not pierce the distance between him and Berlin. At last he bowed his head and said nothing, and in that silence 300,000 men were condemned. The first days of encirclement brought not panic, but denial. German propaganda reassured the troops that relief was coming, that Field Marshal Manstein was assembling a rescue force to the west. The name Winter Storm began to circulate in whispers, as if it were a spell that could melt the snow and reopen the roads. Meanwhile, the Sixth Army dug in. Engineers fortified cellars into bunkers. Anti-tank guns were dragged to intersections and pointed at the horizon. Ammunition was rationed, rations halved, fuel measured in cups instead of barrels. At night, soldiers burned furniture to keep warm, their shadows dancing across the walls like ghosts rehearsing their own funerals. Outside, the wind howled, lifting fine snow into the air until the world seemed made of nothing but white and silence. Each sunrise brought the same question, spoken and unspoken: how long could they last? Each sunset brought no answer. Then came the promise that would seal their fate. The promise of the Luftwaffe. Goering, bloated with arrogance and eager to please his master, swore that the trapped army could be supplied by air. 250 tons of food, ammunition and fuel each day, he claimed, would sustain them until relief arrived. It was a fantasy, a mathematical impossibility. The transport planes, Henkels and Junkers could barely manage a fraction of that under ideal conditions, and now the steppe was a frozen inferno of flak, fog, and Soviet fighters. Yet Hitler believed it, and Paulus clung to it, because the alternative was despair. The first flights came in, dropping crates into snowdrifts or directly into Soviet hands. Some never returned. their wrecks later found miles from their intended targets. The airlift became not a lifeline, but a slow-motion execution, and in the frozen heart of Stalingrad, hunger began its reign. Inside the encirclement, winter came like judgment. The temperature plunged below -30, freezing weapons to hands and tears to cheeks. Bread rations fell to 200 grams a day, half sawdust, half frost. Horses were slaughtered for meat, their ribs rising from the snow like the fingers of a dying giant. Fuel ran out, and vehicles were left in rows, their engines entombed in ice. Men huddled in bunkers, their breath clouding the air, their uniforms stiff with sweat and filth. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and faces, turning men into caricatures of suffering. Medicine was gone, bandages were strips torn from curtains and shirts. The living slept beside the dead for warmth. At night, the sound of distant Soviet artillery rolled across the steppe like the voice of the earth itself, and in those endless nights, even the stars seemed indifferent to human endurance. Beyond the ring, the Soviets tightened their grip. Artillery batteries shelled the pocket day and night, reducing its perimeter meter by meter. Soviet soldiers, hardened by vengeance and winter, advanced behind walls of fire, their faces expressionless beneath frost-crusted helmets. To them, the encircled Germans were no longer invincible enemies but trapped animals, dangerous, starving, and doomed. In Moscow, Stalin listened to reports with grim satisfaction, his orders simple: destroy them all. Zhukov and Vasilevsky coordinated the siege with methodical precision, sealing off escape routes and preparing for the inevitable collapse. Yet even among them there was awe at the scale of what had been achieved. Never before in modern war had an army of such size been surrounded so completely. The cauldron of Stalingrad was now a world unto itself, a frozen kingdom of despair, and its ruler was time. By December, the encircled Sixth Army was little more than a memory of what it had been. The men no longer spoke of victory, or even of survival. They spoke of home, of wives, of children, of sunlight. Their letters never to be sent, filled notebooks buried in the snow. In Berlin, Hitler raged and refused reality, demanding that Stalingrad hold, that Polis fight the last man. The city was no longer a battlefield, it was a monument to arrogance. The Luftwaffe still flew, but its cargo now consisted mostly of body bags and last words. Every flight in was a prayer, every flight out a death sentence. And so the circle held, unbroken, unrelenting, unmerciful. The steppe lay still, blank and white, concealing beneath its silence the sound of history closing in. Stalingrad was no longer a battle. It had become a reckoning. The promised air bridge arrived like a song in the distance. Sleek silhouettes carving the grey sky, props feathering against wind and ice as they descended toward frozen strips of earth that the maps named airfields. It failed. Pilots fought the weather, flak and Soviet fighters, threading ruinous corridors of anti-aircraft fire to reach the pocket with loads that were paltry and precious. Planes broke apart. Crates dropped from trembling bellies of Ju-52s, struck drifts or burst on impact, scattering tins and bandages into snow that swallowed them like hungry mouths. Men watched and waited. Radio reports conflated optimism and arithmetic, promising hundreds of tons while the manifest showed only dozens, and commanders counted each kilogram as if it were coin. Hope thinned. Flights that did return came with fewer men and more wreckage, the Luftwaffe's losses mounting while the winter tightened its grip. Silence followed. Food became geography. Ration lines a map of desperation, where kernels of black bread marked the boundary between waking and collapse. It shrank. 200 grams became 100 and then less. each wrapper torn into pieces to be shared like relics. Men traded trinkets, watches, and finally boots for a scrap of sausage or a spoonful of porridge that tasted of soot and memory. They bartered with shame. Kitchens smouldered under improvised stoves, chefs gone from uniforms to scavengers, boiling wallpaper glue, dried roots, anything that could become warmth and fill a hollow stomach. Hunger sharpened everything. Voices grew thinner, anger replaced by a bone-deep listlessness, and the laughter that had once bound units vanished into the frost. Sickness crept in on hollow feet. The city counted days by what it had eaten. Frostbite moved like a thief in the night, stealing toes and fingers, turning flesh to a black poem that surgeons could not read, while medics wrapped raw limbs in whatever cloth remained and prayed as they worked. It ached. Men whose hands had once loaded machine guns now cupped them like relics they could not release, and faces swelled into grotesque masks beneath scarves powdered with ice. Triage became arithmetic, in which the weak were left for warmth, and the strong carried on until they could not. Frost took what starvation had weakened. It took among the living with the same indifferent patience with which snow buried corpses. Soldiers wrote home in spidery script about honor and duty, signing names that would not be read until after death. Their letters smelled faintly of smoke and the last of their cigarettes. A quiet cult of endurance grew around these notes. Even then they called it service. Disease rode the same wind as frost, moving through hovels and bunkers with the smell of damp and the sound of coughing, and dysentery turned latrines into sites of slow destruction, where men whispered confessions into the dark. It spread. Lice multiplied in seams and hair, sending men into fevered torpor beneath blankets that never fully dried, while pneumonia crept along crowded passageways and claimed those already hollowed by hunger. Medical supplies dwindled as quickly as warmth. Morphine was a memory, saline an impossibility, and bandages were torn from shirts and stitched with trembling fingers. The infirmary became a hall of ghosts, the living iced over beside the recently dead. Medics worked with the mechanical calm of those who had seen too much, their hands moving as if by muscle memory while their eyes grew older. Corpses mounted in corners where no one had the strength to bury them, and their faces froze in expressions that outlived any prayer. Even death was an act of logistics. The living smelled of it. Fuel vanished like a dream, the tanks standing lined and useless as monuments to a campaign that had run out of lifeblood, and mechanics burned everything combustible to keep radios alive and stoves lit. It ended. Engines were stripped for wiring, seats torn for stuffing, and the last drums of petrol used to boil water for tea that no one wanted but all needed. Generators coughed and died. Lights went out, command posts shrank to candlelit huddles where maps blurred into shadows. Men burned wooden doors and planks, the flame licking at ration cards and letters as heat ate the paper that held memory. Warmth came with cost. Those who once moved tanks with confidence now pushed carts of rubble toward a fire that gave only a little light against a vast dark. Conversations shortened to the essential. Name, rank, last meal. The pocket itself cooled. An engine stalled mid-rev. Night lengthened. Morale did not die fast. It eroded, layer by layer, stripped away by cold, hunger, and the daily arithmetic of loss, until only the idea of honor remained as a brittle coin to be spent on a last cigarette. It crumbled. Men spoke less, eyes downward, inventing small rituals to keep identity intact, polishing boots, folding letters into precise squares, smoothing a hat until the felt shone, as if that could keep memory clean. Officers argued about breakout routes in exhausted voices, drawing lines in the frost and erasing them with gloved fingers when no solution appeared. Debate dwindled. In the dark, a sergeant read aloud from a Bible he had carried since Poland, his voice small and steady, and the men listened as if the words could bind them to a country outside the ring. Prayer replaced strategy for a while. Camaraderie tightened like a rope, each man clinging to the other for heat and meaning. And even as structures collapsed, they kept traditions. A song hummed quietly at night, the sharing of the last biscuit. It was all that remained of their world. Letters became relics of a vanished life, their cursive shaped by hands that still tried to believe in return, and the words inside spoke of honor, fatherhood, gardens, and a homeland receding, like a shore beyond a storm-tossed sea. They comforted. Sentences folded into pockets, secreted beneath shirts, read aloud and then burned for warmth, so the message could be both memory and fire. A young private wrote of a daughter's hair and the summer she had laughed, signing with a promise he did not expect to keep, while an old captain mapped his last wishes with an officer's precise calm. The letters were small acts of defiance against oblivion. Some were buried with men who died during the night. Others were tucked under helmets to be found by comrades who would one day fold them into graves. Each page held a life condensed into a few lines, a private archive of love against the roar of guns. They were prayers disguised as paper. The silence after reading them was deeper than the cold. When surrender became inevitable, it arrived not as a crescendo but as a long exhausted exhale, an acknowledgement that the math of supply and weather and geography had finally outweighed doctrine and will. It came, men queued in the snow with hands raised, fingers black with frost, faces hard with a dignity that outlived orders and rhetoric, and in their eyes was an old human question about the price of obedience. They walked through corridors of soldiers who watched in silence, then down into fields where Soviet lines took them as prisoners of a war, both personal and colossal. The aftermath smelled of coal smoke and earth, of iron and the sweetness of disaster's end. Bodies that had been monuments to endurance were lifted like wreckage, catalogued and carried away. Families in later years would look at photographs of emaciated men and ask how a nation had permitted such a thing to happen, and the answer would be found in logistics and ideology and the cold arithmetic of hubris. In the ruins, letters fluttered in the wind like small stubborn birds refusing to be grounded. The frozen tomb closed, but not before leaving a record written in frost on every face, a ledger of suffering and stubbornly of humanity. The snow kept their footprints until spring, when the land would remember and the world would keep the silence no longer. The winter offensive breathed like a slow, deliberate beast as Field Marshal Erich von Manstein gathered maps, men and audacity in a tent that smelled of coal and ink. His plan, later named Operation Winter Storm, was precise and desperate, shaped by the knowledge that speed might still sever a fate already written in frost. Trains slid through night like black needles across the map, carrying tanks, guns, and the kind of supplies that look small on paper and gigantic in practice. Officers measured time in hours and fuel in teaspoons, their calculations folded into the brittle silence of men who had seen too much. Manstein spoke with a calm that did not hide urgency, his eyes tracing routes through forests and river crossings, as if willing roads to open. He understood the geometry of encirclement and sought to prime it with motion, to turn pressure into passage. Men loaded onto flat cars under lanterns, slinging kit and hope into cold air. The southern steppes answered with wind and drift, indifferent to strategy, and so the attempt began. Not with thunder, but with the steady, resolute footsteps of an army trying to rewrite its own story. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army moved like a blade drawn from its scabbard, armoured columns cutting through snow and silence with a terrifying mixture of grace and vulnerability. Tanks churned through drifts that clung to tracks like white wool, their engines coughing steam that formed instant halos in the icy air. Crews worked in bursts of feverish energy, swapping parts with hands numb from cold and patching radios with wire and improvisation. Panzers crested ridgelines, and for a moment the horizon opened toward the encircled Sixth Army as if salvation were visible at last. Supply trucks strained to keep pace, their loads slipping into ravines or buried deep beneath overnight drifts. Mechanics burned everything combustible to thaw engines and lights, and the smell of oil mixed with prayer. The advance kept a rhythm of hope and attrition in equal measure. In some units, exhilaration replaced fear, in others, exhaustion stifled it like a cloth. The sight of Hoth's columns moving northward became, for those inside the pocket, the nearest thing to a promise. Word of the relief thrust reached Paulus like a distant drumbeat recorded in static and hope, arriving in short communiques that folded optimism into restraint. He read maps until the ink blurred, tracing lines 100 times and finding new holes in each pass. Paulus believed in orders and in the sanctity of discipline, but he also believed in the lives entrusted to his command. His staff argued in whispers, their breath visible in the cold of the command tent, their faces carved by fatigue and calculation. Manstein urged bold, flanking maneuvers and speed. Paulus counseled breakout corridors that might reconnect his men to life and supply. Yet obedience weighed like iron. Hitler's command to hold Stalingrad at all costs was absolute. The word hold tasted like metal on the tongue and echoed through radio static like a sentence. Paulus waited, balanced between military logic and the weight of obedience, and the hours slipped away under snow. Weather conspired with command to strangle the rescue attempt, as blizzards arrived and condensed visibility into a white wall that swallowed columns whole. Navigation became chance. A single misread landmark could send an armored group hours out of formation and into disaster. Air support faltered, limited by ice, fog, and Soviet fighters prowling the cold sky. Ground convoys stalled in drifts that crested waist-high, their cargoes buried overnight and lost to the snow as if the earth itself had grown hungry. Men trudged for hours to recover what supplies they could, returning empty-handed and hushed with exhaustion. The mechanized tempo Manstein required eroded hour by hour into a slog of persistent labor and improvisation. Engineers shoveled planks and logs into the mud to fashion roads, and horses, resurrected from obsolescence, pulled wagons through rutted tracks. The land punished movement as if resisting rescue for reasons beyond human ordering. The momentum bled away until the window for a meaningful link up narrowed to a flicker. Within the pocket, men watched smoke on the horizon and clung to rumor like sacrament, each whisper a small miracle and each silence a verdict. Soldiers tied strips of cloth around frozen ears, rubbed numb hands until crusts broke open, and prepared for action that might never be ordered. Officers rehearsed coordinated breakouts in low voice, readying demolition charges to open routes through snowbound barricades and stacking stretchers for the wounded who could not march. A cook boiled ersatz soup and distributed it as if it were celebration, while medics warmed frostbitten feet with heated bottles and prayers. For a time, morale kept a fragile posture of hope, balancing the mathematics of supply against the human necessity of belief. Reports filtered through of Soviet counterattacks, pushing the relief columns back, of flanks threatened and supply nodes severed. The invisible hand of attrition touched both rescuers and rescued with equal cruelty. Men measured days by what they ate, and nights by what sounds arrived from the dark. The hoped-for corridor remained an aspiration rather than a fact. Manstein's advance, despite its audacity, lacked the unified cooperation from high command necessary to bend Hitler's will toward pragmatic relief. He pleaded for more air cover, for armored reinforcements to widen the corridor, for permission to exploit gaps. Berlin supplied rhetoric and delay instead. Field reports that might have changed the course arrived late, swallowed by bureaucracy and the frozen arteries of distant command. Manstein improvised, assembling ad hoc Kampfgruppen to probe and punch where the front thinned, moving like hunters against a patient prey. These efforts won ground here and there, only to see it reclaimed by Soviet countermeasures, applied with ruthless patience. Hoth's spearhead came close enough to glimpse the tents and smoke of the Sixth Army, to hear muffled shouts across the snow, as if anyone could be heard through weather and orders. For a brilliant, brief span, the destiny of thousands seemed reversible. Then the steel fist of command held firm, and the spearhead was ordered to halt. The opportunity evaporated like breath in cold air, and the chasm between what might have been and what was became painfully clear. Across the Soviet lines, commanders watched the falter of the German relief with a mixture of cold satisfaction and tactical concentration, unrolling countermeasures with merciless precision. Artillery rained down on approaching columns, and mobile reserves channeled attackers into prepared kill zones where winter and strategy worked in tandem. Scouts picked off units that had outrun supply, leaving skeleton formations for Siberian troops to finish. Partisans harried the flanks, cutting rails and setting ambushes that turned roads into death traps for convoys that depended on fragile lines. The cohesion of Manstein's thrust relied upon threads of supply and communication that the Soviets attacked without mercy. In command centers, Zhukov read reports and coordinated redeployments with the calm of a strategist who had predicted the arc of events. He let the winter do its work as much as his guns, understanding that the season itself was an ally that crushed what ruthless will could not save. The relief, once a promise, now read like a chapter with a bitter ending. The steppes waited, patient and inexorable, to collect the fruits of planning and season. When Hoth's tanks halted in the approaching dusk within sight of the tents of the Sixth Army, a rare silence fell over both lines, the hush of soldiers who had glimpsed salvation and found it just beyond reach. Men stood on turrets and scanned the frozen horizon with binoculars that trembled in their hands, seeing columns but not the clear path that would have joined them. They heard voices but not the command that would break orders. Polus, bound by obedience to a command that forbade retreat, still awaited permission that never arrived, and his waiting became as lethal as any enemy assault. The absence of a breakout order proved to be an act as deadly as an artillery barrage. Night deepened, and the snow around the hoped-for corridor stiffened into an implacable barrier, turning mobility into stillness. Hoth's panzers, once emblems of German momentum, became statues in a frozen theatre of stalled hopes. Manstein watched through field glasses and felt the weight of what had slipped through his fingers, understanding the limits of operational daring when pitted against political will. The rescue had been magnificent in conception and meagre in execution, brave and bureaucratically betrayed. In the cold light that followed, the moment died in the snow, and the Sixth Army's fate was sealed more by orders than by enemy fire. The opportunity, once almost grasped, vanished into the white, leaving history to count its cost in lives and silence. January 1943 brought a calendar of death to Stalingrad, a month in which the city's ruined skyline and the endless plain around it became a landscape of radio static and dying breath. As the Sixth Army staggered beneath siege and frost, radios hissed. The last clear transmissions were not triumphal but tired, lines of coordinates, casualty lists, and the names of units that would never move again, voice after voice cutting through static like a litany. Silence followed. Command posts shrank into cellars and dugouts, where officers passed orders by candlelight and men read their final letters under the dim glow. It was intimate. Between the Volga and the frozen steppe, the army was no longer one thing but two, northern and southern pockets separated by a ring of Soviet steel and snow. They were split. Supplies dwindled, batteries died, and signals arrived late or not at all, turning coordination into improvisation and courage into stubborn routine. Fate tightened. The northern pocket clung to the riverbank, a bitter tangle of basements and ruined factories where civilians and soldiers became indistinguishable beneath soot and frost. The southern pocket, smaller and more isolated, huddled around the last functioning bridges and ferries, its men moving like shadows between wreckage and refuge. It was fragile. Communication between these bastions was intermittent at best, and once loyal allies, Romanians and Italians, had been battered into silence along the outer ring, trust frayed. Paulus, encircled in his command post, received reports that read like obituaries and held meetings that ended in exhausted nods rather than solutions. He listened. Night after night he stared at maps with furred fingers and calculated possibilities that politics denied, balancing military logic against the iron will emanating from Berlin. Hope narrowed. On January 30th, 1943, in a gesture as much symbolic as strategic, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal, a title meant to compel him to refusal and to dramatize the Führer's demand for an unbroken stand. The promotion stunned the pocket. In Berlin it read like a final proof. A field marshal either breaks or follows the ultimate command, and Hitler apparently expected the former in the name of honor and myth. The message was clear. Paulus received news through the frost-bitten circuits of a dying supply network, and kept his face composed as he considered the meaning rank elevated, options removed. He paused. To the men who watched him, the promotion felt like an act of cruelty, as if a badge might substitute for trucks and bullets. They murmured. Yet Paulus, a man of staff and calculation more than of myth, weighed survival of his command against ritual sacrifice, and his calculations led him to a decision that would shock the Reich. He chose life. The decision to surrender was not a single dramatic moment, but a sequence of small bureaucratic acts, written orders, the reading of capitulation terms, and the quiet of men lowering their weapons in the snow. It was simple. Soviet envoys negotiated terms that were practical and absolute. Lay down arms, march out under guard, and the living would be counted and taken prisoner to a fate that was uncertain, but at least certain of an end to immediate starvation. There was relief. For some officers it felt like treason, for others it felt like mercy, and for countless privates it felt like the only humane conclusion left to a winter that had taken everything else. Emotions tangled. The ceremony of surrender was stilted. Flags lowered, whistles blown, groups of men filing through gate lines into the white and into the hands of their enemies. They filed. Cameras in the Soviet ranks recorded gaunt faces and haunted eyes that would later travel across the world as proof of ruin, images that froze the contours of collapse for history to study. The world watched. Hitler's reaction was volcanic and theatrical. He raged in his bunker, denouncing treachery and promising vengeance while refusing to accept the arithmetic of defeat that his orders had wrought upon the men in the ring. He raged. Propaganda offices scrambled to spin narratives of unbroken resolve, while generals argued bitterly in rooms that smelled of coffee and coal, some accusing others of weakness, some of betrayal. Voices clashed. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin received the news with a mixture of grim satisfaction and calculated restraint, allowing the moment to be both political triumph and a statement of Soviet endurance. He held back nothing. Allied capitals received the surrender as proof that the war's center of gravity on the Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly, and telegrams circled bureaucratic desks with phraseology that mixed relief and foreboding. They took note. For ordinary soldiers and civilians across Europe, the images of emaciated prisoners and ruined streets shattered the myth of invincibility that had carried banners and speeches across the continent. Hope altered. The surrender did not end violence in the pocket. Pockets of resistance continued. Units refused at first to lay down arms, and scattered fighting flared as men attempted chaotic breakouts that were cut down or captured. Medical personnel worked until collapse, triaging the frostbitten and the fevered, while Soviet guards processed prisoners with grim efficiency and the hush of bureaucracy. Order descended. Many officers who had counseled obedience were taken into custody for interrogation, while others were allowed the dignity of walking out with their soldiers under white flags. Some nodded. The captured included not only German soldiers but entire Allied contingents whose equipment and morale had already crumbled beneath winter and gunfire. They stood. For the Soviets, the prisoners were both spoils and burden, manpower to be counted, potential propaganda, and a logistical challenge in harsh weather. They marched. In the following weeks, as columns of prisoners were trundled eastward in blizzards that bit through coats and packed boots with ice, the human cost of the surrender became visible in numbers. Tens of thousands of dead or dying en route, more to follow in camps and hospitals. Death tracked them. The Sixth Army's best officers were taken for interrogation in Moscow, and later displayed to the public as evidence of Nazi hubris, while ordinary men filled transit camps where the cold and disease culled the weak. It was brutal. Stories emerged from the march: a sergeant who saved a child's photograph, and later buried it beneath a cairn of snow, a lieutenant who shared his last biscuit with a comrade, and a cadet who hummed a hymn until his voice failed. Memory persisted. Soviet medical teams worked frantically to prevent contagion and to treat what could be treated, their efforts heroic amid scarcity and the endless grey of winter. They labored. For many survivors, captivity was the beginning of a slow, uncertain odyssey toward release, repatriation, or death, an afterlife of war that unspooled long after the guns had fallen silent. Time stretched. The surrender of the Sixth Army became a hinge in history, a moment when arrogance, geography, and winter combined to overturn plans and reshape destinies, leaving behind a ledger of ruin written in frost and human faces. It remained. The images of emaciated soldiers and blackened ruins travelled across oceans, haunting parliaments and living rooms, forcing nations to reconsider the limits of power and the price of impossible orders. Memory kept them. For Germany, Stalingrad marked the end of an invincible myth and the beginning of a retreat that would last until ruin. For the Soviet Union, it became a tale of survival, vengeance, and the brutal arithmetic of state. History recorded. Yet beyond maps and dispatches lay simple human stories, letters never sent, boots left in snow, a dog that followed prisoners until it could go no farther, and then sat by the road and howled. They endured. In the frozen silence after surrender, the Volga kept flowing, carrying the ash of a city and the echoes of men who had stood and then fallen under orders not theirs to make. The river remembered. The Caucasus retreat unfolded like a slow unmaking, columns of men and machines receding beneath a sky that had once promised conquest, but now only carried the smell of smoke and exhaustion. Engines coughed. Army Group A, once a spear that had aimed for Baku, now moved as a wounded beast, its tanks trailing like rusted teeth through mud and snow. Supply trains lagged. Villages that had briefly known German garrisons were abandoned with haste. Doors left open, kettles still warm on stoves as if their owners might return. Fear spread. Mountain troops descended from peaks where they had once posed for propaganda photographs, their faces inscrutable beneath frost-stiffened scarves. Hunger gnawed. Engineers dismantled what they could not carry, welding axles to carts and burning timbers to fuel stoves in makeshift encampments. Silence fell. The dream of oil, Grozny, Maikop, Baku, had turned into a bitter lesson in logistics, a promise that evaporated under scorched earth and Soviet sabotage. Pipelines were gone. Where black gold had once pooled, engineers found smoking craters and poisoned wells. The Soviets having chosen ruin over enemy gain, despair followed. Manpower was drained by miles of retreat, and the elite units that had spearheaded the summer offensive were now a patchwork of battered veterans, raw recruits, and allied contingents whose loyalty was as thin as their boots. Desertion rose. Romanians and Italians, once props on the southern flank, melted away under pressure, leaving gaps the Wehrmacht could not mend. Panic spread. Kleist's staff sent urgent requests for reinforcement, for rail cars, for anything that might halt the slide back toward the heartland. The answers were empty. Soviet counteroffensives, coordinated from Stavka with growing confidence after Stalingrad, pushed relentlessly westward, reclaiming towns the Germans had occupied only months earlier. Rostov fell. The Don Basin became a theatre of rolling retreats, where columns that had once advanced with arrogance now folded into defensive lines and exhausted rearguards. Bridges were blown. The Red Army, learning from its own suffering, struck with a cold efficiency that combined partisan harassment, armoured thrusts and overwhelming artillery. Momentum shifted. Vorona's, once a name of mixed fortunes, echoed with the sound of Soviet guns and the dull creak of German wagons turning to flee. Morale crumbled. Local populations whose lives had been uprooted by occupation now watched as Soviet flags returned and the retaken cities filled with a mix of jubilation and the grim business of reconstruction. Hope flickered. The retreat became a test of improvisation, as field commanders ordered scorched earth withdrawals, leaving behind equipment too heavy to haul and hopes too fragile to sustain. Tanks abandoned. Mechanics worked under open skies, stripping engines for parts while gunners set up hasty roadblocks to delay pursuing Soviet armor. Cold bit. Railheads that had once fed the advance were overrun or sabotaged, forcing divisions to march on foot for days through mud turned to ice. Feet bled. Supply officers burned documents to stay warm and swallowed their pride as they rationed the last tins of meat among hungry battalions. Shame lingered. In nighttime bivouacs, officers whispered of culpability and miscalculation, measuring blame against the distant figure of command who had ordered them into an untenable reach. Regret settled. For ordinary soldiers, the retreat was harassment and heartbreak, a slow exodus across landscapes that had become hostile through war and weather alike. Children cried. Men wrote letters on scrap paper, folding them into bundles they could not post, their handwriting trembling with cold and longing. Tears froze. A farmer who had been pressed into service as a driver steered a convoy through moonlit fields, his breath white, his hands knotted on the wheel, thinking of his home now occupied by others. Guilt gnawed. In one village, a small group of soldiers stayed behind to bury comrades hastily, the churchyard filling with shallow graves topped by wooden crosses carved in haste. Silence again. The human toll mounted in ways numbers could not fully capture. Lives unraveled, families displaced and veterans whose faces had grown older overnight. Memory endured. In Berlin, the news filtered back in rationed reports, diplomatic cables and the strained faces of couriers who had seen too much to sugarcoat. Panic spread. High Command debated repositioning reserves but found their options reduced by the demands of multiple fronts and the depletion of armoured reserves. Fingers trembled. Hitler demanded new defenses, proclamations, and the heroic language of endurance, even as maps showed an ever-widening arc of retreat that stretched toward the Reich's own borders. Speech rose. Officers who had once been confident now spoke in terms of fallback positions and the necessity of trading space for time. Sorrow deepened. The propaganda machine worked overtime to reshape defeat into narrative, broadcasting tales of strategic withdrawals while soldiers on the ground counted losses and mourned comrades. The gulf between rhetoric and reality yawned. On the other side, Soviet soldiers moved with a grim professionalism, their logistics improved, their tactics refined by bitter experience and the fresh urgency of reclaiming lost ground. Advance continued. Artillery concentrations shattered German rearguards, while tank brigades exploited gaps with a speed that belied the months of suffering behind them. Cities changed hands. Partisans, now emboldened, coordinated attacks on German supply lines, derailing trains and sabotaging depots with ferocious local knowledge. Chaos ensued. Civil engineers returned to rebuild rail spurs and bridges, often working under the protection of riflemen who had once fought for survival and now for restoration. Reconstruction started. Rostov and Voronezh became symbols of Soviet recovery as factories resumed production and rail networks hummed once more with the movement of troops and material. Resolve hardened. The Wehrmacht retreat cut a ragged line across 1,000 kilometers, a slow, grinding pullback that consumed men, equipment, and the myth of invincibility that had once defined German strategy. Exhaustion reigned. Columns moved like a wounded procession, their banners limp, their engines stained with mud, their commanders calculating fallback lines with care born of fear. Regret echoed. For every kilometer the Soviets reclaimed, the Wehrmacht lost not only territory but the elite units whose absence would be felt in campaigns yet to come. Pain spread. Veterans who had once boasted of victories now spoke in whispers of winters survived, friends lost, and a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. Despair lingered. The south smouldered with ruins and reclaimed towns, their scarred streets testifying to the cost of hubris and the endurance of resistance. History shifted. The winter wind carried more than cold across the Eastern Front. It carried the echoes of a campaign whose ambition had outpaced reason. Operation Blue had begun as a dream of oil and empire, a geometrical solution drawn on maps by men who believed geography could be bent by will. What remained at its end were ruined supply lines, shattered divisions, and a ledger of losses that no propaganda could make respectable. Elite units that had once been the spear of German power lay broken, their banners threadbare, their officers dead or in captivity. Men who had boasted of mobility now trudged through mud and snow. Hitler's aura of invincibility, carefully constructed after lightning campaigns in the West, cracked under the strain of attrition and hubris. The Wehrmacht stopped being an invader with irresistible momentum and became instead a retreating force stretched across 1,000 kilometers of hostile terrain. The air smelled of burned oil and lost promises. In towns where victory parades had once been imagined, civilians now returned under Soviet banners to salvage what the war had spared. History took note in the language of ruins rather than monuments. The strategic initiative that Germany had once held on the Eastern Front evaporated like steam from a frozen kettle. After Stalingrad, the Red Army did not merely recover, it learned to strike with coordination and depth that German planners had not anticipated. Stavka's coordinated offensives used reserves, rail mobility, and partisan pressure to exploit every weakness created by the failed southern thrust. Where German maps once showed possibility, Soviet maps now sketched reconquest. Logistics became doctrine. The loss of the Sixth Army and the attrition in the Caucasus deprived the Wehrmacht of not only men but experience, the most valuable currency in mechanized war. Young replacements could not replicate the tacit knowledge of veterans who had learned to read battlefields with eyes of steel. Each retreat taught the Red Army painful lessons in coordination. Each advance reinforced its confidence. By winter 1943, the balance of power on the Eastern Front had shifted palpably toward Moscow. What remained for Germany was the grim business of defense. Beyond maps and maneuvers, Operation Blue exacted a human toll that rippled through families, villages, and barracks across Europe. Graves multiplied in landscapes once promised as triumphal stages, and letters home turned into relics of a vanished normal. In field hospitals, surgeons worked with hands numbed by cold and grief, stitching flesh while asking for more dressings that did not exist. Prison camps filled with emaciated figures who had once recited oaths and shouted slogans under parade flags. Mothers waited. The psychological cost for survivors was a quiet erosion of belief, an understanding that sacrifice had been purchased for illusions of grandeur rather than security. Veterans returning to Germany found towns scarred by rationing and silence, eyes that no longer sought fanfare but a grave. The families of those who would never return kept photographs and ration cards like talismans against oblivion. Memory in this way became a moral ledger against the hubris that had set thousands marching east in search of oil. The war's arithmetic had become personal. From the Soviet perspective, the collapse of Operation Blue represented both vengeance and a painful vindication of endurance. Stalin's generals, having watched their country burn and their cities fall, now marshalled industry and manpower with a ferocity that matched their grievance. Factories east of the Urals produced tanks and guns with a tempo that astonished German intelligence and bolstered the Red Army's strategic reserves. Partisan networks expanded, cutting rails and blowing bridges, turning the German rear into a battlefield of attrition and insecurity. Citizens returned sometimes to find their homes reused as barracks for their liberators. The reclaiming of Rostov, Voronezh, and the Don Basin was more than territorial recovery. It was the restoration of supply routes and the unmaking of enemy narratives. Victory parades would later be held in reclaimed squares, but the work of rebuilding began at dawn with mud and timber and sweat. Soviet soldiers, hardened by winter and hard experience, moved with a new confidence that would mark every subsequent offensive. The Eastern Front had become a contest of production, morale, and relentless logistics rather than a single stroke of strategic genius. In Berlin, the shock of failure reverberated through ministries, staff rooms, and Hitler's inner circle with a noise like shattering glass. The regime responded with a mixture of denial, recrimination, and the frantic search for scapegoats that could explain away the arithmetic of loss. Promotions and purges followed, and field commanders found their discretion increasingly curtailed as Hitler insisted on dictates that mirrored desperation. The propaganda machine worked overtime to recast retreats as strategic withdrawals, a linguistic sleight of hand meant to preserve morale at home. Yet shortages of fuel, food, and men were visible in the streets and factories, and the myth of invincibility could not be sustained by speeches alone. Allied governments abroad adjusted strategies with renewed optimism, noting that the German war economy had been wounded in ways that would take years to mend. Political opponents whispered about the costs of adventurism and the limits of power when error and ideology superseded prudence. The Nazi leadership grew more brittle, more suspicious, and more dangerous in its internal politics as defeat loomed at the periphery. War fatigue set into civilian life with ration lines and the hollow eyes of returning widows. The price of hubris was now also a political dividend, instability at the core of a regime whose outward confidence could no longer mask its fragility. Militarily, the ruin of Operation Blue forced a re-evaluation of doctrine in the German High Command. Though not always a quick one, the myth of blitzkrieg, rapid, decisive maneuvers collapsing enemy will, met the stubborn realities of depth, logistics, and industrial capacity. Officers debated at last about the limits of maneuver when supply could not follow, and about the fatal cost of dividing force across remote axes. Many argued that the army's mechanized corps had been wasted in a campaign that prioritized political aims over military prudence. Training emphasized now not only speed but resilience, and the ability to fight a defensive attritional war across vast distances. New doctrines would stress rail capacity, fuel security, and integrated air-ground logistics as preconditions for any future offensive. Yet the human factor, experience, and morale proved impossible to replace with textbooks or commands. The Wehrmacht would thus spend the remainder of the war attempting to adapt while losing the qualitative edge that once underwrote its early success. Rigid command and political interference continued to sap initiative at the tactical level, even as manuals updated to reflect hard-won lessons. The curriculum of defeat had begun. In the years after the campaign, towns and families wrestled with how to remember a catastrophe that had been both national strategy and private devastation. Memorials rose where graves lay, simple stones engraved with names and dates, small admonitions against repeating the past. Veterans returned with stories that conflicted with propaganda, their accounts raw, unadorned, and sometimes disbelieved. Memoirs and novels later tried to grapple with the moral complexities of obedience, duty, and responsibility amid total war. Film and photography preserved skeletal columns and ruined factories, images that would shape popular memory for generations. Schools taught children about sacrifice in tones that framed Stalingrad as both tragedy and turning point. Families passed down ration cards and letters in boxes that smelled faintly of diesel and cigarette ash, artifacts of a history that would not be laid to rest. Commemorations became battlegrounds for narratives, for those who sought to frame the conflict as necessary, and for those who insisted it had been avoidable. The cultural memory of the campaign was thus contested, layered, and inevitably human in its contradictions. Ultimately, the price of hubris paid in the snows of Stalingrad extended far beyond the loss of territory or tanks. It altered the moral and strategic calculus of a continent at war. The Reich had gambled on a short, spectacular victory and found instead that history exacted payment in attrition, prisoners, and the collapse of initiative. The elite cadres that once formed the hard bone of German offensives were broken or dispersed. Their institutional memory dissipated in camps and graves. What followed was a grinding defensive struggle in which momentum belonged increasingly to the Red Army and to Allied air power projecting force into German-held space. For ordinary Europeans, the campaign marked a hinge from aggression to collapse, from myth to reality, and from certainty to doubt. Politically, strategically, and morally, the failure rippled outward, influencing alliances, resistance movements, and the planning that would end the war. Yet amid statistics and dispatches there remained the small human stories that defined the campaign in ways numbers could not capture. A photograph tucked into a soldier's breast, a funeral on a frozen field, a child returning to a house with no roof. These details became the true ledger of cost. The Eastern Front would never again know a German advance of such scale, for the war had turned its center of gravity and began its long slide toward an end written in snow. The snows of Stalingrad closed like a verdict, and in that white silence the world felt the heavy pulse of history itself.